Well, I think we're all waiting with bated breath to find out the results of the forensic testing. Those reddish brown spots have got to be blood, and we want to know whose DNA is associated with that blood. I mean, if it is any of the victims, this is really bad for Brian Kohberger. But even if it's just his own blood, the question is, why is he bleeding on a mattress cover or a pillowcase? Oh, could he have cut himself? But of all the things on that list, I'm going to argue that the hairs are the most important, and that possible single animal hair, if that traces back to Kaylee's dog, nail in the coffin, I think, in terms of what Brian Kohberger comes.
That's what I thought.
That's also what I thought. So yeah, it is. If the hair does trace back to Murphy, you could imagine that really would be a nail in the coffin. Of course, if the samples come back as blood from any of the victims, that would also be extremely hard to explain. She does talk about the fact that she doesn't think that this case may go to trial, and that's the question I've posed to you guys in the chat. By the way, apologies if I seem a little fuzzy. I've only just woken up, but it's good to see you guys again. Trying to dodge the outages, but it's good to see you guys. I want to just play the clip where this expert talks about whether she thinks the case goes to trial. I think I've got it over here. Welcome, everyone. Good to see you. I'll chat to you guys more directly in a moment. Okay, let's do that.
And of course, that is what his defense attorney would do if it goes to trial, which I truly don't think it will. It depends. The point is it reasonable to a juror to think that an animal hair from the victim, Kaylee's dog, went to the pizza parlor with her, ended up on him and back at his place, and by the way, he is accused of killing this woman. I mean, you just have to put yourself in the shoes of a reasonable person. But I mean, between that, the vacuum bag contents, this is going to be critical because it could have skin fiber. I mean, the triangulation is happening. The dotted lines, especially with your terrific guest from People Magazine reporter, who's talking about those contacts, those DMs through Instagram. I mean,
okay, so the momentum seems to be shifting with this case in terms of if you Google Idaho student murders, you don't really have stories on that day anymore. It used to be every single day. Now stories are 2-3 days old. You're seeing a lot of folks in the true crime community move on to the next high profile case. There's kind of this perception of, okay, see you again in 5 months or so. See you again in June. And I mean, 4 documentaries have just come out. It is quite surprising how true crime can have this laser focus, and then just like that, show's over. Okay, let's move on to the next show in town. My channel's a little bit different. We will continue paying attention to this case for quite a few more days and weeks and possibly even months going into the future. There's still actually a lot to look at, and I'm sure a lot more information is going to be filtering through. And it's a lot harder to be on a case, go and deal with another case, and then come back to the original case with the same amount of immersion when you do that. Whereas if you stay in it, it sort of expands, sort of opens up, right? So that's what we're going to be doing. I do want to be covering the Alec Baldwin case, even though there's not a terrific amount of interest, doesn't seem to be. But for me, it's a legally very interesting case, and it's quite interesting how people have strong opinions on the legal aspect when not sure if they understand the legal aspect so well, and that's the part that I want to sort of deal with. In this analysis, what I want to share with you guys is that sort of thing that I'm talking about, that when you immerse yourself in a case, some of those subtleties start emerging. And what I'm going to share with you guys today isn't rocket science. It's not, I didn't like go on the ground like Nancy Grace or some of these other creators. I simply went through what we already knew, but just with a fine-tooth comb, and collated a lot of that information. And it's quite amazing what you saw, but you didn't realize what you were seeing, if that makes sense. So we're going to deal with that. We're going to deal with this idea of, is the case going to go to trial? Kohberger's got 5 months to change his mind, and the case against him only seems to be getting stronger. Innocent until proven guilty. I think the biggest thing in his favor is this whole idea that does he have an accomplice? If that builds up momentum, he might get that sense. Jeepers, the folks out there really are stupid or whatever. Maybe I can outsmart them after all. But anyway, that sort of raises reasonable doubt, that whole idea that if there's an accomplice, well, then we really don't know what happened and who is this other person, and let's make that the focus kind of thing. So, and then the other thing I want to talk about is the sort of hand-wringing of criminology professors to some extent. So those who didn't teach him are sort of saying, making their assessment, but also saying, oh no, there's absolutely no link between Kohberger and what he studied. We'll deal with that story in a moment. It's really that story. I'm going to deal with that story a little bit later. But I also want to, where's that image? Is it this one? I also want to just sort of ask you guys, if you think about this case in a very broad way, like what is the main thing, the main obvious thing that differentiates this case from, let's say, Chris Watts or any other case that we've dealt with? What's the first thing that pops in your mind, right? What is the most idiosyncratic thing basically about this case? What do you guys say? Let's see who is here. Chelsea, welcome. It is an upsetting case, definitely is. The apparent lack of motive for murders in a house. So notes in terms of the perpetrator, the alleged perpetrator, the suspect in this case, how is he a totally different animal to so many other perpetrators we've looked at? A clue to that is on screen. Any ideas? Come on, guys. Yep, that is it. Thanks, Christopher. So this is what makes this case different is you literally got not only is it within a student setting, but the alleged perpetrator was actually studying the thing that he wasn't supposed to do. He was studying criminology, not just willy-nilly, but PhD level criminology, right? And some of the, you could argue, some of the best criminal, I don't want to say criminal minds, but the best criminal professors, I guess, in America. I would imagine that Catherine Ramsland sort of qualifies as the sort of legend, and she's one of the professors that taught him, right? Thanks a lot, Robbie. So what stands out is that you had a student studying criminology and then allegedly also committing a crime, a particularly vicious and sadistic and shocking crime in the middle of his studies, right? So the fact that it's a student that is the suspect of killing students is what makes it so idiosyncratic. It's sort of a student that seems to be showing how much smarter he is than his fellow students. You kind of get that sense. And you don't really get that sense with a lot of other crimes where I want to show you how clever I am. Like, did you get that with Chris Watts or Scott Peterson or in the John Benet Ramsey case? I suppose you could say the ransom note was an attempt to outsmart, but not by being too sort of self-reflexive, if that makes sense. Is it Marietta? Marietta, how do you become a member? Will you just hit join? So it's important to see cases in that basic way, to say what is idiosyncratic about it, and that's what is idiosyncratic about the evidence, about the whole. It's in a way a lens that you're looking at everything through, but it needs to be the right lens, right? So where's that? So I'm gonna just show this to you, and then we're gonna deal with the fresh insights. But I want to come back to this at some point. This tweet put up by Catherine Ramsden. She's maintained a discreet. She sort of not really commented on this case. She sort of exercised her right to remain silent. But about 12 days ago, she posted this tweet on a Twitter profile that's not particularly active. So it was quite a big step doing this. And she was highlighting this article. Is there a link between the fact that he studied criminology and this crime? And so let me ask you guys that question right now. Do you think there is a link? Do you think it's totally irrelevant that he studied criminology? Do you think it's totally irrelevant what he was studying and thinking about and the kinds of criminals they were looking at and the type of crime that we're seeing here? Totally irrelevant. Is there a link? Isn't there a link? What do you guys say? So in terms of the poll, let's see where we are. 88% say you think it will go to trial. 12% say no. Okay. Jean says there's no link. The fact that he was studying and at the time and a student and the victims are all students. It's got nothing to do with studying criminology. And I guess you could even say nothing to do with studying. The fact that it was studying, a student, happened in a student fabric, is just irrelevant. It just happened to be that. DB says, I think he will want to go to trial. Okay. So some differences of opinion here. Detective Juan says, you never read any of my comments. Well, I have now. He told his neighbor it was a crime of passion. Do you think he told the neighbor that because it's true, because it's not true? To put them on the right track or on the wrong track? Do you think he did make those calls to forums, do you think he did that to help the investigation or to hinder the investigation? So for those saying there's a definite link, and I think there is a link, I've been trying to make the case for bad Teachergate, that incident where he was grading so strictly that it led to kind of a formal protest by his own students. That is a big part of this case, big part of the unfolding, the unraveling of the potential psychology. So I guess if you say, no, there's no link in what he was studying, then what is the link? How do you put it together why he did what he did? Is it because he's an incel? Is that the link? That's right. He would want to do that. Okay, so we're going to now move away. We're going to come back to that question. But first, I want to deal with the subject matter of this particular episode, which is fresh new insights, right? And let's see if we can bring those up. Here we are. Okay. So this story is already 3 days old. I actually wrote it 3 days ago, and it was while I was researching the number 8 clue we all missed, the crucial significance of bad Teachergate. Let's do a quick poll on that. Do you think bad Teachergate isn't significant? Do you think? What do you think? Bad Teachergate's not really got anything to do with this case. Let's see what the crowd are saying. So think about what that involves. It involves public humiliation, a kind of public flogging, being criticized by about 75 kids, standing up in front of 150 and being openly criticized for your lousy, annoying approach in terms of X, Y, and Z, right? Now, for a lot of people, that might be a bummer, right? But for some people, that could be incredibly devastating. So someone who's more sensitive than somebody else, that might be particularly difficult to recover from. Someone whose whole persona is I'm really smart, that might feel particularly embarrassing. Someone who's socially awkward as it is might find that sort of exposure, mass exposure to dissent, pretty emasculating, not just humiliating, emasculating. It might make that person feel like I'm done at this college, like it's over. And wasn't it? Wasn't there a sense that nobody really liked him? Not only his students that he was teaching, but also his peers, his fellow classmates, his fellows studying the PhD. Momo says, yeah. So if you're following what I'm sort of trying to get at, I'm challenging this notion from this expert, super genius criminal professor who says, who seems to be implying through the link in that article, is there a link? Is there a link here between this guy studying criminology? Is there a link? I don't know if I see a link. And I'm trying to say, is there not a link? Is there not a link here? And so one of the very first things, I think the number one clue we all missed was who's the odd one out? Well, who's the odd one out in the criminal faculty in Pullman? If you could just sort of wander in there sometime and say, guys, who's the odd one out here? Like who sort of standing out as an oddball, somebody nobody seems to like, and I think pretty quickly Kohberger's name would likely come up. Don't you agree? That's a good point. You know, he self-identifies as this, in a sense, like as this criminology degree. It's all about that. and I don't know if you know, do you remember when you studied at university, for those who did, it does tend to be a self-defining thing. People ask you all the time, oh, what are you studying? And then you say that, and then it's kind of like that thing of what job do you do? In a way, it does define who you are. I'm not saying it is who you are, but it is often quite self-defining, especially when you're at university level. It's kind of like your statement of who you are, or who you're going to be. And at this point, I'm a PhD in criminology. Oh, okay. Gina says there's definitely a link. Don says the bad teacher is something number one. Okay. I agree, it's defining. Okay. So with that in mind, we're now going to go into fresh new insights. Okay. So something that is very, very weird and very humbling, both as a photographer and a researcher. Sometimes when I'm trying to get I'm a photojournalist, so sometimes when I'm trying to get a particular photo, on your way to trying to get something that you've got in your mind, you end up taking a random or accidental photo of something else, and that tends to be by far the best shot. Not something you intended, not something that you predicted or had imagined, something that was sort of just by the way. And that's like the most brilliant shot that you sort of come up with. Research is often the same way. On your way to trying to find something, you stumble on so many other things that are 10 times more significant. And it's in a similar vein to that I actually found these insights that I'm going to share with you. Last night I was looking for, so this is after I wrote the script. Last night I was looking for that moment where Martha says the worst thing that happened, the worst thing that's been taking place are these TikTok sleuths. And I honestly went through so much of the documentaries that I had, and I simply couldn't find it. But on my way to looking for that, I found so many other things. And that is the reason why we need to have the scout mindset, right? In other words, it's within this context of I'm actually looking for something else. But what the point is, I'm actually looking for something that you end up gathering additional information. Suppose another thing you could simply do is just say, I'm going to just go and look at everything that I think I know. But we tend to not do that. But I'm just saying it's happened so often when I write books, when I take photos, when on your way to doing the thing that you were trying to do, you find information that starts to change everything. And that's in a way how this took place. It was in the research to piece together the whole bad Teachergate thing that I came upon what I'm going to share with you guys right now. Okay, so here we go. We're going to be talking about two areas in particular now that I think have been underserviced in a sense. It is the journey. Yeah. Well, in true crime, I think it's about the destination. You want to get to the ultimate, is this person innocent or guilty? I mean, that's also part of the journey. So we're going to be dealing with two aspects: the dynamics, which I think is very an underrepresented area in this case, and a sort of unknown area. And then we're also going to deal with the timeline, which I think is another area where we think we know what it is, and you're about to find out that we may not know it nearly as well as we thought. Okay, so that's within that framework. dynamics, timeline, and then we'll come back to Catherine Ramsland and that article. Okay. So first of all, did you know that at Pullman, his classmates in the doctoral program regarded Kohberger as the black sheep of the class? Did you guys know that? So we're talking about dynamics. That's the first point I want to make. Did you know that his own classmates, not his students, not the kids he was teaching, but his own peers, thought of him as the black sheep of the class? Did you guys know that? Dover says, I'm not surprised. Raven says, yes, I did know. Sarah says, not a surprise. I didn't know that. Okay. So can you see how you can have a situation immediately of kind of tension if at home is sort of a mama's boy, or the golden child is the only boy in the family, but they have quite a close, he's got quite a close relationship with dad, and you know it's sort of like the golden boy. My son is studying to be a doctor, he's getting his doctorate and all of that kind of thing. But then in the real world, actually in the classroom setting, he's not such a superstar that he is in his hometown. And there's another story dealing with that where Brian was actually sort of regarded as a hero in his local town. I'll deal with that at another time. But I mean, that already puts things in a totally different perspective. That even in the sort of relative intimacy of his class, right? So he's studying to be get his doctorate in criminology, even within the relatively intimate confines of the classroom with the kids studying the same thing he's studying, right? So I'm not saying they kids his age, because I think he was still older than they were by maybe 4 years or so. He's also regarded as an outsider, and these are the kids you would imagine he would most likely. I remember when I was at university, you hang out with the kids in that you are studying with. You know what I mean? You make friends with the kids in your class. You hang out with them. You date some of them. You go to dances with some of them because you see them every day. You do develop the same way you develop a relationship and friendships with kids at school that you see every day for years. Same thing happens in college. Yes, you can also meet people that are studying something else, but I'm just saying it's quite normal that you get to know your classmates pretty well and their friends and all that kind of thing. That is the case with me. Now, what happens when your classmates see you as the black sheep? Are you going to be hanging around with them? Are they going to want to hang around with you? Is it a compliment to say something like that? Especially within the criminology sort of mindset, would it be a compliment to say, almost, let's say everyone was studying theology, would it be a compliment to say he's the, almost like saying the Judas Iscariot of the class? Would that be a compliment? So in this whole idea of we studying crime and criminals, well, this guy's the black sheep of the class. Is that a compliment, do you think? It's not. I don't describe him as the genius black sheep, or like a backhand sort of compliment. It doesn't seem very complimentary at all. Okay, so I want to show you where I got that information. That's also quite important. So let's do this. So there you see the bad teacher gate. Now, even his peers are actually, in a way, calling him a bad teacher, right? Because they are also going to be teaching assistants, I would imagine. And even his own peers are calling him a black sheep, which is another way of saying a bad teacher. If you go and watch the movie Bad Teacher, look at the supercilious, arrogant attitude of that teacher, played by Cameron Diaz, is actually quite a good movie. And how other people are rubbed the wrong way because of that arrogance, because of that attitude. So it comes from the New York Times, and here is the reference. Can you guys see that? Let's do this. The fellow student who spoke on condition of anonymity because he feared that speaking publicly could jeopardize his safety described Kohberger as the black sheep of the class, often taking contrarian viewpoints, right? And sometimes getting into arguments with his peers, particularly women. So he was argumentative as well. He was contrarian, and so it's quite important to look at how was he contrarian. Also, that he argued in particular with women. He seemed to have a bone to pick in particular with women. And not to put too fine a point on it, but this fellow student is a guy, right? It's a guy saying this. It's not obviously someone who, a female student who he'd insulted. It's just a fellow student. I wouldn't be surprised if it's a guy called Ben, because there's a list of, there's some photos that show some of the student names and photos, and one of them was a dude called Ben, and Ben has provided some information before. I wouldn't be surprised if it is Ben, but we don't know. In any event, Ben is saying, I saw him arguing with women. I noticed he was very contrarian, and there he says it. He described him as the black sheep of the class, right? There it is. So that's one of the first insights I came across, and I just read it in an article, right? If you want the source of that article, it's this article from the New York Times. He'd been a student of the criminal mind. And again, this sort of brings up the question to me, not was there a link between his studies, but just what how can I put it? What did that involve? If there was a link, what did that involve? And what are the underlying dynamics? And that's kind of what we're going to go in right now. And it is definitely quite fascinating. So the question I kind of want you to see as a thought bubble over this cap is this whole idea of Catherine is it Ramsland or Ramsdale? Can never remember. But anyway, is professor saying, is it, let's see, Ramsland, okay. Sort of saying, is there a link? Is there a link? Is there a link? And now we're going to attempt to address that question, because it is an important question. Specifically, is there a link between him studying criminology and what's taking place, right? And now we're going to really look at that. Okay, so the next thing is kind of going into his backstory. I think before we do that, I want to show another excerpt from this article. So can you read that? Also from the New York Times, another graduate student. So it's another peer, another classmate who knew Kohberger, said he was keenly interested in studying policing, right? So that just gives us another idea. He's not just going to study criminology, actually wants to join the police force or study policing. And he had worked as a security guard. Did you guys know that he worked as a security guard for, I think, at least 3 years, maybe 4 years? And part of that is why he's older than his peers as well. I would imagine his peers are 23, 24 years old, and he's 3, 4 years older than what they are, right? So the student who spoke on condition of anonymity because of worries about upsetting others in the department said Kohberger had few friends at the school. So this is, if I understand this correctly, this is a different student to the one who said he's a black sheep. It's another one speaking anonymously, right? And this person's assessment isn't that he's a black sheep, simply that he didn't have friends at the school. And then here it is. Look at the highlighted text. He appeared to want to socialize. Wasn't that he was just there and I'm better than everyone else, and I'm sort of a nerd, and I'm just interested in getting my doctorate. He's actually reaching out. He's, I guess, trying to impress them and trying to fit in with them, but failing. He's not impressing them, and he doesn't fit in with them. But look at that at the bottom there. He made offensive remarks in the past that left him somewhat isolated. That's incredible. That's incredible to see that in black and white, that he made offending remarks, and there's the word isolated. So not only do you get the sense that he's seen as the black sheep, but what happens to a black sheep often? They stand apart from all the white sheep, right? You can see them and they become the odd one out. I mean, that's literally the definition of the odd one out, the black sheep in the flock, right? Yeah, he didn't have the social skills, but he also seemed to have an attitude, didn't he? Now, I have made the comment before that, they say, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. You kind of get the idea that he's come from some other culture, in a sense. Not like he's come from Poland or Australia or, I don't know, South Korea, right? It's not like he's come from a different country, but there is nevertheless a cultural tension taking place that doesn't seem to be particularly sensitive to. And so the end result is bear in mind, with all of this plays out in the second half of last year, so between June and November. So it actually feels like almost immediately he opens his mouth and people don't like what he says. They don't like the way he stares intently and he's sort of quite quiet in a way. They don't like what he's saying or how he's saying it. And so very quickly they see him as the black sheep, argumentative, and is isolated. That seems to happen very, very quickly. And if that wasn't bad enough, it hails back to when he was in high school, when he didn't really get along with the girls. I'm not sure about the guys, but didn't really get along either. He was bullied then as well. So now he might actually feel like he's being bullied. On the other hand, you could argue that doesn't it seem like he's being quite bullying? He's imposing his view on everybody else. Don't you kind of get the idea that he was trying too hard, that he was trying very hard to fit in? And I've heard that as well, in terms of when he was at school, that he was trying very hard to fit in and he just couldn't. And sometimes the answer to that, to trying hard to fit in, is don't try so hard. Accept yourself. Don't talk so much. Don't be so, just have some confidence. Don't work so hard. Don't try and overcompensate so much with your own perceived sense of insufficiency, right? It does seem like that. It does seem like he was overdoing it. I agree with you, Harry. Yeah. Detective Juan says, um, anyway, I'll let you guys read that. Okay, so do you see how this raises? So when you think of him in the classroom setting, not getting along with the kids around him, you've got to start thinking about things in a very simple and practical way. And one of the things you ask is, how old were they compared to him? What was the age gap? Was the age gap kind of a factor? So were they less mature than what he was? Was that the problem? Or was it actually almost the opposite? He's older than them, but he's actually even less mature than what they are in a weird sense. So, and this brings us to, he worked for several years, at least 3 as a security guard. And that means he must have been about 3 or 4 years older than they were. And so you kind of have, I think, this idea that the older kid is a know-it-all. The older kid is pushing his weight around, and the younger kids don't like it. I kind of experienced that when I went to advertising school. I think I was in my late 20s, and almost all the kids were early 20s, mid 20s at the most. And so I was at least 5 to 7 years older than what they were, and actually also going bald at the time. Like I had a little bit of hair or whatever. And something that was really weird, just to mention it now, is this is many years ago, by the way. When I say this, you'll realize what I mean. I was the only kid in that class that had my own laptop. So think how far back this was. It was around about 20 years ago, 20, 21 years ago. I was the only kid that had my own laptop, and this is pretty expensive laptop that I bought in the UK. It had a really big screen, and on the one hand, I think they thought, "Wow, that's a really good idea, and lucky you." On the other hand, I think there's a bit of resentment. How are we supposed to afford a laptop? And so some of them would borrow their parents, and I think there's some story that I was the first kid to do a presentation on a laptop or something like that. Um, but you can see how that can upset the what would have been the natural dynamic, that other kids at that age, you might think that's absurd now. How can you not have a laptop? But we're going back quite a long time, decades, literally, right? I'm just saying, just in terms of that, you can see it can upset the apple cart. And I did actually eventually have, because they put us in teams, and then you'd cover a campaign, and then you'd be in a different team. And then there were some kids who'd come up to me and they'd say, can we borrow your laptop? And I did, uh, lend it out to a couple of them. But can you see how, because I was older, it creates a little bit of a unfair, you could say, advantage in a way. But someone else might also feel they don't really like it. It's not really fair in a way. And and I do think when you don't like someone in a situation like that, you can find them very arrogant. Um, yeah. The other thing that I found quite weird was a lot of the kids that I was studying with, and I'm going to come back to Brian. A lot of the kids I was studying with were from pretty wealthy backgrounds and quite privileged kids. And because I'd been out of the house for quite a while, I was sort of on my own, and so I was had to work quite hard, kind of as a blue collar person, earning money to kind of pay for my studies. And so you had this weird thing where, although I had this laptop that was pretty snazzy, quite expensive, I was also working crappy jobs to get through the year, whereas they were still living with dad, or their parents had put them up in a nice apartment kind of thing. And so you had all these different tensions in different areas. It was definitely quite interesting. And anyway, the bottom line is that, can you see that there was tension between Brian and these younger kids in terms of the other PhD students? There definitely was tension. And it does seem like they just didn't like him, right? Class issues. And so again, we need to keep thinking about this question: is there a link? And so what, if there is a link, what is this link? What is this link to bad feeling, enmity, dislike, even hatred, right? Now, when the question came up some time ago, like, have we dealt with criminals in the past who killed with no criminal record, right? People were saying it's a serial killer, and I said no, and then I said, haven't we dealt with people who've killed more than one person just like that, and they've got no criminal record? And then you mentioned, for example, Chris Watts. Then you say, no, that doesn't count because it's family members. But can you see how it's a situation where Chris Watts felt he was no longer part of his family? He wasn't, in fact, when he went to North Carolina, he didn't even talk to his wife. He didn't even go to see, he wasn't allowed to go and see his own parents. But anyway, you kind of had a situation. He even said that it was like his daughters had forgotten who he was or weren't very nice to him, kind of thing. But you kind of had this thing of that 5-week period. It led to a situation where, and of course, him having an affair, let's not forget about that. But it led to a situation of, even within the family unit, he'd kind of become the black sheep, and he'd kind of become the outsider to his own family. And I think you could argue in a similar way that he was outside the family of students. It's not like he was just, it's a totally different setting to going to work or a situation like that. There's a situation in a classroom that feels a lot like a family. You do everything together, you eat together, you take breaks together, you go on certain kind of trips together. Everything starts at the same time, everything ends at the same time. You're all supposed to do the same assignments. There's a lot of time spent together. And so how much more invalidating is it to be kicked out of that family, kicked out of that herd, than just a sort of random situation? Can you see the point that I'm trying to make? It is a little bit like that, being literally kicked out of a situation where you're supposed to be part of it. That's it. That's right, Elizabeth. Okay. So this isn't just Brian emerging as a little off or creepy. It's pretty much his entire class have decided he's offensive, and not a little offensive enough that they collectively isolate him as a result. And I must say, when I saw that word, let's bring it up here. When I saw this word, somewhat isolated, bear in mind the person who's telling the story is acknowledging, in a way, you know what? I was part of the group that we decided to lock him out, to isolate Brian. We made a collective decision, and I was part of that, to kick him to the curb, to isolate him, to keep him to the side, to not involve him in our things, right? So you've got a group collectively isolating him. Do you see that? Thanks a lot, Alpaca Renee. Okay. So in a flash is not just is lost the most natural way of connecting anyone in the university setting. Do you see that? Can you imagine what that feels like? You changing colleges, you're going to another college, and you probably have these little fairy tales in your mind where you think of the fun you're going to have and the stuff you're going to do and the friendships you're going to make. And you kind of have little glimpses of that on your way there. You see couples holding hands, having picnics together, laughing, all those sights and sounds. And then only for you to end up in your classroom as the odd one out. Didn't quite work out like I imagined. So Marcus says he was probably acutely aware of his exclusion. He had to be. And isn't that why he ends up in Moscow? Because he sort of felt like, I'm not going to make any friends here. My goose is cooked in Pullman. They don't know me in Moscow. So the other side of it is because he's isolated, he overtalks, which then turns off his neighbors as well. Then he turns off the younger students that he's in charge with as a teaching assistant. So think about everyone he's turning off. Well, it's literally everyone. It's his peers that are studying what he's studying. It is the kids he's teaching, and it's not one or two, it's like at least half of them, 75 kids. And then even his neighbors don't like him. And then you kind of have this weird, vicious cycle. He's lonely, and so he he tries too hard. He tries too hard to be likable. He's talking too much. He's trying too hard to fit in, and then that only makes him more weird in a way. His oddness, but also his poor social skills are only emphasized even more because he's talking so much, he's trying so hard, and then he's isolated even more, which only aggravates the situation to begin with. Right? What I'm going to share with you now, I share with actually a profound sense of sadness. I'm just giving you another example of an analogy to this. I was actually, I think it was not last year, the end of the previous year to that. So I think it was around about October or November of 2021 that that something happened, and it was following. I had a friend who was very similar to me, writing books, sitting in courtrooms, dealing with the whole true crime thing. But he was different to me in that he felt like he needed to get a official badge next to his name. So he literally went back to university, and he was studying, I think, forensic science, which is, I guess, very similar to criminology. And I spoke to him dealing with certain cases when it was things like blood alcohol and that kind of thing. And what I would notice with him is he would talk to me more and more and more. I wouldn't get a chance to say anything to him. And after a while, I actually didn't like talking to him because it felt like very, very one-sided. And I really did get a sense, and he said it to me as well, because he was also an older kid, an older person going back to college. I think he spoke about sleeping on the floor, and he was just living a very hard life, just trying to get this credibility. And I wouldn't say I was his friend, but I did know him. And I suppose you could say we were friends. If I went to trial, I sometimes bumped into him. He would consult with prosecutors, whatever, they would consult him. And but I did find, we go out for lunch every now and then. I did find that he chewed your ear off. And if I had a conversation with him on WhatsApp, he'd send these long uh, messages, and you couldn't really have a conversation with him. And I didn't like that. And towards the end, he would send one message after another, after another, after another. But it seemed more like he was making a speech. And he ultimately committed suicide. And I felt really horrible, because I sort of felt like he was actually reaching out to me, and I was put off. And shouldn't I have recognized that he was alone? And I mean, I did. And help him in some way. And it would have helped if he'd simply said to me, listen, I'm feeling lonely. Can't we just have a conversation or something? You know, reach out in that way, instead of just make these long monologues. So you really do have that relationship between people who are alone and lonely, who don't get to talk to anybody, and then when they do, there's this deluge. There is this absolute sort of waterfall, and you don't get a word in edgeways. And that requires that you put yourself aside, and just let that waterfall do its thing. But I mean, the feeling that I got after that was regret, that I wished I'd been a better friend to him. I don't live in the same city, so it wasn't like that. And some of the things he was asking me to do just didn't make really any sense. He wanted me to appear as a guest on his YouTube channel, but anyway, his YouTube channel like had 100 subscribers or something, but it was also like totally geared to the South African audience. And I think I was trying to encourage him to be more broad-minded and also deal with American cases, which he didn't want to do. Anyway, but the upshot is, someone who's just being lonely can be a source of tremendous existential tension, right? Just being lonely can be a source of tremendous existential tension, and all of that tension is exacerbated by everyone around you is having such a great time. You're in a sort of setting that is by definition, a social setting. Lots of students hanging out, lots of students having fun, lots of students having the time of their lives. What's happening with you? Well, you actually the most miserable kid in that situation. Okay, so just want to bring up this, and just think about again what Brian has been for most of his life is a student. He's 28 years old. For 3 or 4 years of that time, he was a security guard. But besides that, he's a career student. He's been a student for the rest of that time. And most of that time, he's not been treated very well by the kids around him. And he's trying to. It's like, how do you impress in a classroom setting? How do you impress your peers? In a PhD classroom setting, how do you get the respect of the people around you? What's the most obvious way to do that? If you feel like you aren't getting the love and the whatever you deserve, how can you try and get them to change their minds or change their hearts? Absolutely. And so isn't that his like number one thing? I'm smart, look how intelligent I am. And so he's working harder than all the other kids to show that he knows what he's talking about. But then that in a way manifests as basically arrogance. I think they maybe misunderstand him. He's just trying to fit in, but they see it as he's a smart aleck. He's intense. He's weird. He doesn't understand that you give respect to earn respect. A big part of, um, arguably, the biggest part of making friends and being a friend is somebody who listens. Well said, Grace. In other words, not doing something, just being attentive, being sensitive, listening to what they've got to say. Also relaxing, also being yourself. When you're trying to show how smart you are, you're not being yourself, you're trying to be something. And um, if you imagine that Kohberger did commit this crime, wasn't that the part of that whole thing of trying to prove something, trying to show something, right? Do you see what I'm saying? It's the same thing, now at a very extreme level. It's the same thing of I'm trying really hard to fit in. I'm trying really hard to show you that I'm a person worthy of your attention, your respect, your whatever. And then doesn't he eventually reach this level? Sasha says maybe he should have been nice to people. I think this was his version of being nice. His version of you argue with someone thinking you can convince them that you um, have a worthwhile idea about something. That's also true. Okay, so let's continue. So so within this context of someone who's being deliberately isolated by his peers, right? He's trying to reach out, he's trying to socialize, he's trying to connect with them, and all he's achieving is them actually literally pushing him away collectively. And within that context, we also have confirmation that he's passionate, intense, has a temper, and has anger issues going all the way back to childhood. So what I want to emphasize here is this idea of it's not just someone who pitches up at Pullman and the kids don't like him and it's tough, right? I don't know if you've ever been bullied. It's not a nice thing. I don't know if you've ever been also ostracized. Not very nice. Um, but that's not the full story. The full story is we are dealing with an individual who is passionate, who's intense, who's got a temper, who's got anger issues. It's come up over and over again. And if you think I'm coming up with those descriptors, I'm not. Those are descriptors I noted that other people who knew him said, right? And so someone who's passionate and intense and has a temper and has anger issues, and they are over talking and they're trying to make their statement and they're being ostracized. Can you imagine how all of that is going to get triggered? He's going to become more intense. He's going to become more passionate, right? Imagine he's trying to convey his point and he's doing it with more and more energy, right? And then when there's a disagreement, he starts losing his temper, and that's not a very good look either. He starts getting angry, and that's not a good look either, right? So can you see how it's not just someone who's odd and speaks a lot and is lonely? You've got this undercurrent of basically frustration. those passions are going unfulfilled. You can take the whole sexual narrative completely out of it and just say he wants to say something and have someone, I guess, nod and say, wow, you're so clever. He feels strongly about what he believes, and instead of that resonating, it aggravates, and so the intensity only increases. So can you see how you have a dynamic being sketched out here for an escalation in a particular psychology? In other words, he's reaching out, he's trying to belong, and no matter how hard he tries, in fact, the harder he tries, the less he belongs. So you've got a recipe for a conveyor taking you into criminal psychology, into literally not someone who's studying the criminal mind, but someone whose mind is becoming a criminal mind, right? Can you? What I'm saying is, we are seeing the mechanism, um, the gears and so on. We are seeing how all of that is now fitting together. That is now going to create a conveyor, taking this person's psychology, it appears, in one direction. It's escalating, the tension's getting worse, and it's going only in one direction. And then you can ask yourself, hypothetically, what could have released all of this tension besides quadruple murder? What could have prevented this or satiated all of this pain? Honan, good to see you. I don't know if he took a trophy. If he's running out of his own crime scene, I don't think he took a trophy. Marcus says if he could have come across as less intense. So here's another possibility. If he just made one friend, if there's maybe another outcast in the class, maybe they could have become friends. Or if a girl thought, you know what, almost like in Big Bang Theory, someone is so objectionable that they're actually funny. Like who's that? I haven't watched Big Bang Theory for such a long time now, but you know what I mean. Someone who's so obnoxious, so objectionable, so basically awful, but they are smart, and you do have to respect them for that in a sense. And some girl sort of could have come along and been like, you are what's the word? You are how do some people express that? You are a piece of work, kind of thing, right? Sheldon. So if he could have come across as a likable Sheldon, someone who's basically just a really odd duck and really rude and insulting, but there is something ultimately charming about him. But for whatever reason, he doesn't come across that way. Because one thing Sheldon isn't is angry. Another thing Sheldon isn't is, I think you could say, is intense, and I think you could say he is passionate. But you don't kind of get the idea that Sheldon is angry, do you? You kind of get the idea that he's a harmless rogue in a way. Whereas with Brian, is he that harmless? Does he come across as harmless? If he's losing his temper and is intense, does he come across as harmless? That's also a good point. Yeah. Okay. That makes me laugh. Sorry, where is it? That's the one I meant to highlight. Thanks for that. Mel Stiller, you should watch just one episode of Big Bang Theory. Sorry, it's a little bit got a little bit of hay fever here. He's not mean-spirited. Can be, but is also can be a good friend sometimes. Okay. So can you see we're not dealing with a natural introvert here. We're not dealing with someone who is isolated and alone because that's what he chooses. We're dealing with someone who's an introvert, someone who's isolated because he's rejected. It's not the outcome that he wants. He doesn't choose to be an outcast. He is forced to be an outcast. He's forced into this role. And it's not the first time. Detective Juan says, I'm just curious whether TCRS is Freudian or something. Not really sure what you're talking about. You seem to be someone who's trying very hard to show how clever you are. If you want to know what psychology I subscribe to, it's this: terror management theory. How we as a society deal with death and anxiety, the anxiety that arises from that, and then also how criminals in particular, how do they deal with the anxiety? How did Brian deal with his anxiety, right? And again, it raises this question, is there a link between what he was studying, what he ended up doing, right? And then you say he was struggling with anxiety, social anxiety, right? And then didn't he try and connect with other kids outside of Pullman, and then he was rejected all over again? Or was it at that stage a fait accompli? He had already developed a hatred of his fellow students, and he wanted to get them back. Sheldon is the character in Big Bang Theory, if you're not sure what that's about. So can you see, we're not dealing with an introvert. We're not dealing with a loner, someone who's just like naturally like a Chris Watts type. We're dealing with an extrovert who becomes antisocial. He becomes anti-socialized. He becomes a reluctant lone wolf. Does that make sense? Have you ever thought about it that way? He doesn't choose to be a lone wolf. He becomes a lone wolf. He doesn't choose to become antisocial. He is in a way, what's the word? Is in a way nudged in that direction. Can you see that? Eric asks, could you speak about why you cover cases half a world away? It's kind of a long story, but the short version is I started true crime with, I really shouldn't be doing this because I should do this at the end. But anyway, I started true crime with the Oscar Pistorius case. And that's how I met an American blogger. And then she introduced me to Jodi Arias, and then I wrote about that. And then that's really how it happened. I think the other reason is South Africans aren't interested in true crime because true crime is a everyday reality here, and it's a pretty it's a bummer. Crime isn't like a concept here. It's a imminent threat. And so in America, there's a very lively, interested audience, whereas over here, people aren't interested in true crime. Most people aren't interested in true crime here. True crime's in the news all the time. You could even say that we are victims. The lights going out, just the situation when you go out your door is a symptom of ubiquitous corruption, right? So, yeah, so I don't know if that answers your question. It is a way of life, yeah. Draco says, how do you know Brian is angry? Well, from what his classmates have said. So there are numerous instances where he was confronted and he was about his own behavior, and then he appeared shocked. We know we know from his classmates back in high school how he responded to that, right? And then also, if you take what the coroner said, the person who committed this crime appeared to be feeling a lot of rage. So I can invert the whole thing and put it back to you and say, do you think he wasn't angry? Do you think if you went to a college setting and didn't have any friends and you're trying very hard to reach out, and whatever the reason, you simply weren't having the experience everyone else was having, would you feel happy, right? If you approached girls and all of them rejected you, would you come out of that feeling happy or not? And I think in a more general sense, you could ask the question, do you think incels in general are calm, kind, friendly people, or do you think they're angry? Do you think a high level of frustration leads to happiness or anger? And obviously, the problem that is taking place with that anger is he's now blaming someone else. Someone else is to blame because he's not fitting in. And he's not blaming himself. He's not trying to find some other route to solve his problem. Yeah, incels are angry and frustrated. So now we're going to deal with a little bit of his backstory, and hopefully we're going to learn something here as well. According to the New York Times, before moving to Pullman, Kohberger spent most of his life in the Pocono Mountains regions of Pennsylvania. Do you think that means anything? Do you think it means anything that he spent pretty much his whole life in that particular region of America, as opposed to he lived in Texas for a year and then he also lived in California? So, in other words, do you think moving to Pullman was much of a change from what he's used to? Would it have been as big a change if he came from, say, California, or if he'd lived in a few different places? Do you agree that his life prior to coming to Pullman was insulating? That's well put. Annette, good to see you from Australia. So can you see how being insulated can lead to becoming isolated? Having an insular approach to a lot of things can mean when you're in a different setting, people realize you don't seem to know much about the world, or you don't seem to know how to connect with us. And someone was saying, how do you know that he's angry? Like, uh, where does that come from? And so here it is from the New York Times. Casey Arntz, who was 1 year ahead of Kohberger at Pleasant Valley High School, said he was known to have a temper, and that he did kickboxing, apparently because he knew he had a temper as well, and he did that as a way to get his anger out. Now, if you think about that, it's almost like this idea of, I'm angry. What do I do when I'm angry? I sort of get a punching bag and I sort of hit at that punching bag, and then I feel better. And so next thing is in Pullman, Washington, and now he's starting to feel angry again. Well, was he doing kickboxing? Was he doing any sport? As far as I know, he was running, but in Pennsylvania. He was doing kickboxing in Pennsylvania. Was he doing any sport in in Washington. And I would submit that if he did, so if you say, what could Brian have done? Not what could his classmates have done, what could someone else have done differently? What could Brian have done differently? Well, he could have taken up sport, jogging, skiing, I don't know, whatever. And then maybe also he could have gotten a dog. Um, if you're feeling very isolated, as I was during the pandemic, get a dog. It does make a big difference. And getting a dog also helps you to meet other people who are walking their dogs. But here is confirmation that he had a temper as far back as school, and was often angry. And why is that? Because he's frustrated. And so he's frustrated in high school, frustrated at varsity. What is missing from Kohberger's story from the beginning of it to the end of it? It's kind of like, well, who was his best friend? Have you sort of had someone put up their hand and say, you know what, I was Brian's best friend. I still am, or something like that. You had that with Chris Watts. You don't have it with him. You had someone who was a friend and then felt like I've actually got to cut ties with him because he's become so unpleasant. You don't have a girlfriend coming forward saying, you know what, I was Brian's girlfriend, and I thought he was a nice guy. You don't have that at all. Okay, so let's continue. So these are the comments about him being passionate. This is from someone else who knew him. He was really passionate about what he was doing. Not just passionate, really passionate. Patricia says, that's a weird question. What are your thoughts on female incels? To be honest, I've never really thought about it. I think male incels are a danger to society. Female incels probably need to get in touch with male incels. Chelsea, just get a dog. And here's the thing about him being intense. I didn't come up with these statements. These are all from, as I say, this research that I was doing. Ms. Norton, so that's another character that's come forward, said Kohberger's quiet, intense demeanor had made people uncomfortable. To be honest, I'm not quite sure how you are quiet and intense. I'm not quite sure how that plays out. I'm not quite sure how that appears. But then she also says he made comments against LGBTQ people. So he aggravates the fact that he's not connecting to people in a proper way, because he over talks and whatever, by making literally offensive comments, by arguing with people. So you can imagine if he went to Pullman and he just tried to listen a lot more and try and pick up the vibe, that he may have done a lot better than trying to impose himself. But you do kind of get the sense that wasn't he a little bit insecure, and so he's trying to overdo it, overcompensate. Isn't this crime possibly a illustration of that as well? Overkill as well, overcompensating as well. And once again, he ends up embarrassing himself. Yeah, that's true. We're not, I don't know if you've noticed, we're not really talking about psychology here. We're talking about his backstory based on, we're talking about dynamics. And then this is the other side to him that has come up quite a few times. He wants everyone to know that he's smart. And that can be quite off-putting. I mean, I've experienced that a lot on my true crime channel, where you're trying to show people that you've figured something out, and then people who don't like you say, Tipus, you're really arrogant, you think you're so clever, or whatever, right? So sometimes when you are trying to do your thing, it simply is off-putting. You think you're really smart, don't you, kind of thing. I get that a lot. And or you call yourself the most authentic channel. Who do you think you are, right? And you're trying to, in a way, you are trying to reach people. You could even say impress people, but you're trying to establish your credibility. And by trying to do that, you end up losing it, right? Gaylor says, so Gayla, I must tell you, virtually every high-profile case I deal with, people say he's autistic. I hear that virtually everyone is autistic, everyone is a psychopath, everyone's a monster, and everyone's evil. It's virtually every single case I deal with that comes up. And it's really not helpful because well, I suppose you could say, okay, he's autistic, turn your computer off and go to bed. We've solved the case. The criminal in this case is autistic, case closed, we've figured it out, great. And by the same notion, you could go to the next high profile case and say, you know what, I'm pretty sure he's autistic, case closed, we don't really need to talk about it. I just don't think the autistic label or the Asperger's thing is very helpful. I really don't. What we're trying to do here isn't label Kohberger, is we're trying to figure out what the real dynamics were, right? So it's literally like if someone's trying to get to know you and you say, no, I'm an extrovert, that's who I am. No, but in what way? Do you go to concerts? No, I'm an extrovert. But we're trying to know, like, practically, what do? Do you go to restaurants? Do you eat out? No, I'm an extrovert, that's who I am. Not giving you any insight into who a person is. So we're trying to avoid those sort of labels, right, on this channel. And there are a lot of other channels that do the opposite. Guys, this expert says we're dealing with that, and that's the answer to the whole thing. No, it's actually not. It's the opposite of finding the answer. Absolutely. Okay. So let's take it a little bit further. So he wanted everyone to know he was smart. Don't you think that holds hands? This idea, which is also, as I say, very idiosyncratic to the suspect in this case. It's different to Chris Watts and Scott Peterson. They are trying to outsmart. I mean, every criminal is trying to get away with what they're doing, but they're not really trying very hard to. They're not killing and then killing someone else and killing someone else to demonstrate how scary and clever they are, right? I committed a knife crime and no one heard anything, right? Right? Doesn't that hold hands with the fact that you're dealing with someone who's studying his PhD? You're dealing with a student. And isn't a student's sort of main mission, to, especially a PhD student, to get high grades and to show how smart they are? Isn't the difference between one student, well, these are my grades, and that student, well, these are my grades? And so you get this weird bottom line with Brian, where his peers say he was always trying to show how clever he was. Let's do this. He creeped people out because he stared and didn't talk much. But when he did, it was very intelligent, and he needed everyone to know he was smart. So can you see what's going on? He is smart. in the class setting. He probably did his homework. He probably did his research. And he is book smart and maybe does know what he's talking about. The problem is, the problem, let's put it this way, the problem isn't that he's not smart, and the problem isn't that his peers aren't getting that message. The problem is he's forcing it down their throats. The problem is he is so intense and so passionate and so angry in the way he's trying to convey himself. Does that make sense? Thanks a lot, Chelsea. Some interesting comments here. So do you remember what I said was the motive? The motive was to the motive behind that the way I see it was that the suspect wanted to gain power. This is all about gaining power, but also demonstrating power. And what happens if you smart but people don't respect you? Doesn't it feel like you powerless, impotent, helpless in a symbolic sense, right? Can you see how the motive of someone who's trying to get power and demonstrate power does resonate? It's not something that we plucked out of the air and can be easily updated with a better motive. Thanks a lot for that, Don. I'm not quite sure what that means. Talking about the pen in my hand, it's just a pen. Not quite sure what you're referring to. He is trying to regain his power. Okay. So do you see what I've highlighted there? He needs everyone to know he was smart. And again, you asked the question, is there a link between this guy studying criminology and needing everyone to know he was smart and then the crime itself? Let me ask that again. Is there a link between what he's studying, a PhD in criminology, and needing everyone to know he's smart and the crime? That needing everyone to know he's smart is part of the dynamic. Do you see that? A very important part of the dynamic. Why does he need everyone to know he's smart? Because they don't know. Because they don't accept him or like him or respect him. So how is he going to force everyone to know that he's so smart? So ordinarily, you might think of those as positive traits, those traits that we mentioned earlier. I'm going to put them up in a second. Ordinarily, think about these traits. They're often positive in the people we like. Passionate, intense, and smart, right? So you could kind of play devil's advocate. Why wouldn't you like Brian? He's passionate, intense, and smart. What's wrong with that? In fact, if you describe me with those words, I don't know if I would be insulted. If you said, Nick's passionate, he is quite intense, he can be intense, and is intelligent, I think I'd say, thanks, I appreciate that. So why is that a problem? Gaylor says, sorry, but if you've known the social cues problem, I'm not sure what, are you referring back to autism? I'm not quite sure what you're referring to there. What I'm trying to say is, if you say, Gayla, what I'm trying to say is, if you reduce it all to autism, maybe it feels like an epiphany in your own mind, but it actually stops you from trying to figure out what is going on. That's all I'm trying to say. And I'm also saying that in every crime that I deal with, going back to John Benet Ramsey, oh, the suspect in that case is autistic. Oh, the suspect has Asperger's. No, try and get to know in what way they are odd, not the label. Keep applying the label. Oh, he smiles in an odd way. Oh, he's got Asperger's. Well, let's not continue thinking about that. That's really my point. And often you do have with genuinely intelligent people, and I really don't know whether Kohberger qualifies. I really don't know. To be honest, I don't think so. But with genuinely smart people like Sheldon, like Elon Musk, there is a difficulty in social settings. There seems to be this weird thing where you get genetically gifted with intelligence, but then you lose the ability at the same time to think you don't have emotional intelligence, put it that way. You see that a lot. But I don't know if we're dealing with that with Brian. I don't get the idea that he's a particularly intelligent guy. Maybe he was book smart, but dumb in many other ways. I mean, emotional intelligence is the thing. So let's come back to this whole idea. Being passionate, intense, and smart are positive traits, or often positive traits. And so how can those traits manifest in this story in an incredibly negative way? Well, what happens if your passion isn't fulfilled or is frustrated? And let's think about Brian's passion in two respects. As a sexually passionate person, but also as a morally passionate guy. I'm a vegan. I don't approve of LGBTQ, whatever. And so he's passionate in certain ways that people like, and he's passionate in certain ways people don't like. In terms of his passions, he's intense about it. And can you imagine if he's making anti-LGBTQ remarks and then he gets intense about that? And then he tries to be smart, that makes it even worse. So we're not dealing with any ordinary, natural, or normal. Sorry, let me say that again. Passionate, intense, and smart. This isn't ordinary, natural, or normal anger at the end of the day. And this is where there was someone making comments about psychology. This is where we start opening a couple of doors into that area, right? Right. So in terms of passionate, intense, and smart, it's not ordinary, natural, or normal. So what we're talking about here is it's not ordinary being passionate. The anger isn't just a little bit of anger on the side. We're talking about something that is so extreme. Well, let me reverse engineer it. How ordinary do you think these feelings are? How ordinary or normal do you think they are if they lead to quadruple murder? If someone is suffering from these emotions and being overwhelmed by them, do you think that they are normal and natural and at a average level if they lead to someone knifing 4 people to death in an absolute bloodbath? Would you say that those feelings had reached a normal level or an extremely abnormal level? That he's got like violent fantasies. So again, the anger and the temper is floating alongside these feelings as well. And that's the critical part to add. So if you look at those words, passionate, but he can also be passionately angry. Intense, but he can also be intensely angry. Smart, well, he can also execute that anger in a way that he thinks is intelligent. Angry rage, sorry, intelligent rage, right? apply all of that to what we're seeing in the crime scene. You see? Well said, Chloe. It's at an extreme level, right? And the other side to that is add to that the heroin episode, and you've got someone who's not used to delayed gratification, right? If you take the 3-4 years, I'm not sure how long it was, that he was a heroin addict, that was a long period in the middle of his formative years where he's supposed to become a person who learns social graces. He's supposed to become a person who learns how the whole social intercourse situation works. He's supposed to figure out where he fits into the world and how the world responds to himself. And instead, he runs away from that and indulges in the heroin episode, right? And so he's used to when he feels a certain way that he gets an instant result, just like that. He's used to when his emotions aren't the way he wants them to be, he just changes them like that. Now he's in a situation where even he thinks he's really smart, but he's floundering in a kind of emotional hell and he doesn't understand why. And he probably blames somebody else for that. I'm not doing anything wrong. I've lifted myself up out of struggle and pain and despair, and this is the reward I get for that. And so passion becomes obsession, intensity becomes fixation, smart turns into sly and manipulative. And yes, that feeling of wanting to show everyone he's smart persists. You see how we built it up just from that perspective of listening to what his own classmates were saying, pausing on this whole black sheep thing, and what does that mean? Pausing on the import of these little statements that together give you a sense, a real sense, an authentic sense of who we're actually dealing with. Passion becomes obsession, and we know he's obsessive compulsive in certain ways. Intensity becomes fixation. You can be intense, right? And then you take that intensity too far, and now you're fixated. And at the end of all of that, he wants to show everyone he's smart. That sense persists. I'm failing at what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to show everyone how clever I am, and that feeling only grows deeper and darker. I am going to show them. I am going to outsmart them. Students, right? I'm not going to target, what's the word? I'm not going to target sort of random civilians. This is a bone I've got to pick with other students. I'm going to outsmart them. I'm going to show them. And as Marcus says, aren't we dealing with an addictive personality? He gets addicted, obsessed, fixated with certain ideas. They won't let him go. That happens to a lot of criminals. They start having fantasies and they can't let go of them. So what's also important is how, in the brief scheme of bad Teachergate, we see just how reactionary he can be. So that's another insight, is we're dealing with a reactionary person. We're not dealing with someone who you do something and they can absorb it. They can ruminate on it. They can interrogate it. They can choose their response. You're dealing with someone who reacts, right? You're dealing with a prickly personality. So someone like that, we're dealing with someone who goes from Dr. Jekyll in terms of his attention to and the defense of his attitude to grades to Mr. Hyde, right? So specifically in this, in the concept of a reactionary, when he's confronted by the faculty, you are not grading appropriately. Look how he reacts. He goes from overgrading, and I do want to deal with that dynamic in a separate episode where we look at exactly how was he grading, exactly what did he say, exactly why was it so annoying. I will be doing that, so look out for that. But what I'm trying to get at is the faculty confronts him, and how does he react to that? Well, in an extreme Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde way, he goes from this intense, like, how can I put it? He pays so much attention to detail in assessing and grading and defending whatever he's saying, to the opposite. He doesn't care. He gives them high grades. It goes from, it's like black and white. He goes from this very careful and like a caring lecturer, but sort of is overly involved, to totally disinterested, full marks, well done, leave me alone, right? Can you see how kind of reactionary that is? You can see, you can get a sense in that he feels insulted, he feels slighted, and he feels like, well, you're not worth my time anymore. He's shut off, and he's also trying to prove a point by doing that. Oh, you interested in my feedback? You insulted me, you're getting nothing more from me, right? Do you sense the anger in that? People who are reactionary are angry people. People who are calm and who can sort of, there's a stimulus, and then there's an interpretation or a translation or some kind of transference, something that interrogates that stimulus, then leads to a response. It's not stimulus response, stimulus reaction. Calm people can internalize something to some extent and then decide how they're going to respond. And that's one of the joys of life, is that, do you realize you don't have to react to everything? You can actually choose the way you're going to respond. That's a major difference between law-abiding people, good citizens, and sort of the criminals out there, is they don't interrogate the consequences of their actions. They stimulate it in a way, and they want to react in a criminal way, and they don't anticipate enough the consequences of their actions. Sounds good, Mel. Okay, so let's continue. So can you guys see? Let me illustrate what I'm talking about. I want to keep his. I think it's this. Yeah. I want to keep his eyes in the picture. Let's do it like that. So can you see, this is again from the New York Times. Now I'm trying to illustrate here through a practical example the Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde thing that's taking place. Students said that Kohberger had a strong grasp of the subject matter. So in other words, they appreciate that he's not an idiot. He succeeded in that. They do understand that he is an intelligent dude, but they don't like the way he imposes his intelligence, forces it down your throat, shows off, all of that. So they appreciate that he's got a strong grasp of the subject matter, but he's a harsh grader. And there it is. He gives extensive critiques of assignments and then defends the lower marks when the students complained. So even when the students confronted him, he defends himself. He says, no, that's not right. But he's giving extensive critiques. He's going beyond the minimum and beyond even what is really being mandated to do. He's going I don't even want to say the extra mile because that sounds like a compliment. He's going too far. He's giving these extensive critiques to show off how smart he is. And then he defends it. But then he does an about turn, and there's no extensive critiques, and he gives them high marks, and he doesn't need to defend that. You see at the bottom there, it says, at the time of the killings, he starts giving better grades, and he doesn't really, is not involved anymore. He's not interacting. He's sort of washed his hands off of the people around him. Again, is there a link between this and the crime? What the crime's doing and what the crime's communicating? Is there a link between the Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde in Pullman and a possible Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde in Moscow? Yeah, he is trying to shut them down. It is about shutting down. He is shut down. And then it says here at the bottom here, at a certain point, he stopped leaving all the notes. So at a certain point, the notes just disappear. That's got to change. They say on some of the assignments, he once had his feedback scrolled across every paragraph, and now they come back clean. And then he eventually stopped leaving notes at all. That's quite a reaction. That's quite a reaction to, we don't like how you're grading us. Okay, I'll give you guys all full marks. Do you think he really wants to do that, or do you think there's something cynical and sarcastic and point scoring in that reaction? It kind of shows a shallow, brittle personality. Someone, can you see it? It's showing someone who struggles with low self-esteem, right? And so if he can be this pernicious, this spiteful on in terms of an academic thing, how much more so is he in another sense? This is a little peek into angry, passionate, spiteful Brian, right? That's the part we know about. Is there another part we don't know about? And again, it's this idea, are we dealing with someone who's really had enough of being an incel and being isolated and struggling to get somewhere in his life when everyone else is having so much fun? Everyone's having fun except him. And then on top of that, he's being humiliated in this class setting, and his own peers are calling him a black sheep. How does he feel about that? How does a person who's quick to anger and reactionary feel about that? Right? And this isn't just someone and someone else. This is in a university setting where it's filled with gratuitous enjoyment and fun and excess, right? There's a lot of sex, a lot of partying, a lot of happiness, a lot of the best memories you'll ever make. And in the middle of that, someone's going through their own personal nightmare. It's a contrast of them having all of that and him having nothing of that. It's a contrast of them reaching out to one another and them embracing one another, but kicking him to the curb. Yes, he was. He was a teaching assistant. Okay. So he goes from being sort of withdrawn, looking down and seeming uncomfortable. That's the other Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde thing, is they say that at the time of the murders, that he seemed to become a bit more withdrawn, sort of leading up to them in that sort of ballpark. And also when he was giving classes, he would look down, he seemed uncomfortable. And then he becomes like the life of the party after the murders, as though he's just gotten the release, just a confidence boost that he needs, right? And so we get this statement from B.K. Norton. This is also from the New York Times. No, I think he did plan on returning. I mean, he stayed on campus much longer than a lot of other kids did who left immediately. He also went back to the medical center when others didn't honor their appointments. I think he very much planned to return and complete and get his doctorate because it was about showing how smart he was. So I think he did plan on returning. I do think he was extremely angry about the grading humiliation thing. And the question is there a link between that and the house you see next to me? Was there a link between that anger and how he expressed that anger? Did he express that anger in the house that you see next to me? Chelsea, thanks a lot for that. Chelsea says, some recovering addicts never learn to leave that behind. And I think that is very underestimated here and very true. If he did manage to leave it behind, I don't think the damaging impact on his brain was left behind, meaning is used to getting the feeling he wants when he wants it, just in terms of that kind of wiring. I want to feel good about myself. Drug, I feel good. Well, are you able to do that without drugs? Are you able to solve problems and feel good, warm and fuzzy without drugs, right? And so I agree with that. The other side is, did he have a relapse? When he's alone, what does he have to lose? He's alone, he's up all night. And I mean, aren't the other kids taking drugs? Aren't the other kids getting drunk? So why wouldn't he, as a former drug addict, why wouldn't he, if he's feeling particularly unhappy, why wouldn't he take substances? He's in a fabric of excess, parties, drugs, sex, drugs, rock and roll. So why wouldn't he? Yeah, he was an insomniac. Okay, so can you guys see? Let's bring it back up. So BK Norton, she was in the same graduate program, also doing a PhD. She said he continued attending classes after the killings had occurred, and now he seemed more animated, right? So again, you've got the Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. After the killings, he's suddenly more lively and more interested, and it's almost like he's got his confidence back. It's almost like whatever problem, whatever blockage was there is now gone. Whatever thing was frustrating him and making him feel closed and inferior, whatever, that's gone. He suddenly feels like his old self again. He seemed more upbeat and willing to carry a conversation. So there was obviously a period where he'd shut down, not only to his peers in class, but also to his students. And then he comes back strong. He comes back and he's upbeat. He's happy to have a conversation, and is more animated. So I guess he's waving his arms and is showing a lot of facial expression and whatever. And so in some way, whatever happened at 1122 King Road, he comes out on the other side of that happier. It kind of reminds you a bit of Chris Watts during the sermon on the porch. He seems relieved. He seems peaceful. He seems to have a sparkle in his eye, right? And so again, I want to bring you back to this whole idea that his former lecturer gave, right? He studied criminology. Is there a link? Is there a link between Kohberger and him studying criminology? What do you guys think is the answer to that? Is there a link? Do you want me to slow chat down? Okay. Give me a second. So again, do you guys think there is a link between him studying criminology and possibly committing this crime? Could there be a link? Oh, that's slow enough. What do you guys say? At this point, in terms of the poll, make sure you vote if you haven't. Do you think this case will go to trial? 89% say yes. I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure it's going to go to trial. Jean says, I still think no link. Okay. You must have found the analysis here really annoying then, like, because it's about showing how there is a link. Maybe you're misunderstanding the question. It's not simply, did he read this book about criminology and then he went to commit a crime? It's the whole fabric of he's studying criminology. Well, what does that involve? It involves, where does he study it in a classroom? What impact does he have with his fellow students? And also the whole thing, does studying the criminal mind have any impact on him developing a criminal mind, or even he has the criminal mind and it then takes him one way or the other? Now, I don't think you can get away from the, so Mel says the link's clear to me. Aussie Jen says, I'm not sure about a link. Corina says, I voted no for trial. Susan says he got his power back in his major by exerting. It does seem that is what we're wondering. Don says, so it's a clever statement, but I don't think you could have a mistrial if you have proof of jury contamination or something like that. Someone said he was trying to understand himself. In Dharma, like, something that really stood out to me in Dharma was Dharma thought at the end, when Dharma was arrested, he said, can someone please explain to me why I am the way I am? And he, I think in his own words, also said something to the effect of, I was born this way, right? He believed that he was destined to do what he was doing, that it was simply self-realization. And I don't agree with that, because I think Dharma fantasized a lot. If you took the fantasy away, if you don't feed that wolf, that wolf is not going to be hungry, right? For that kind of thing. And he was feeding that wolf with the fantasies that he had. The other thing that I want to emphasize is this idea of, was this a particularly extreme crime, right? So if you had a situation where you had a criminology student assault someone or murder someone, that would be bad enough. But yeah, you've got 4 people murdered, and he possibly would have killed more if the dog wasn't barking and if things had played out more smoothly than he anticipated. For example, the victims not fighting back and them being perhaps more under the influence or whatever, and also there not being a guy there, right? What I'm trying to get at is, this was not just a criminology student, he was an advanced criminology student. Also, he was studying serial killers, people who'd killed multiple people in horrible ways. And so isn't he emulating the high end of that aspect, right? That's the question. Isn't he emulating extreme crime? isn't he inspired by extreme crime? And I think that's the fact that when the crime happened in the first place, people said serial killer, and then you turns out that this guy was actually studying serial killers and studied under a teacher who specialized in that field. And then to actually have the temerity to say, well, there's absolutely no link. I don't see any link between this. When the media and the true crime community intuited the whole serial killer thing, even before we knew who this was, intuited a serial killer feeling. And then you say, no, there's actually no link to that. And then he turned out to be studying that. I find that really remarkable. The problem is if you believe that this is who you are. In other words, again, stimulus. I've got these thoughts in my mind. Well, I'm going to just react to it by doing X, Y, or Z. What the failure part is that bit in the middle where you interrogate, you sit with that idea and you internalize it, and you're able to transform this feeling that you have. You're able to negotiate with it, and you're able to sit with it. And you can see how drug addicts habitually do not do that. They feel a certain way, and then they treat that just like that. There's no negotiation. There's no natural feeling your way, finding your way out of that passage. And so they never learn how to do that. They instead learn how to avoid doing that. That's not a bad point in the sense of, now bear in mind is a suspect at this point, right? Innocent till proven guilty, but bear in mind, not bear in mind. I agree with you that any person sufficiently ostracized is going to become a problem to themselves and to society, right? Let me say that again. Any person who's extremely, and in a horrible way, where they're humiliated, emasculated, um, extremely frustrated because they are locked out of society, is probably going to become a problem to their fellow man. You seem to have that situation in the Amanda Knox case. Was Amanda Knox able to party with Meredith Kercher, right? How happy did she feel about that, right? And you might say, yes, but Amanda Knox was found innocent. The question is, Amanda Knox was in a student situation. Did she not mind being ostracized by Meredith and her friends? Just a question. So I'm not trying to make the case that Amanda Knox committed any kind of crime. I'm trying to make the case that, do you think she was happy to be living with someone who basically said, we're not going to be hanging out with you. We're not going to be spending Halloween with you. How do you think that felt? In the Chris Watts case, I've explained it a moment ago that he felt ostracized from his own family. He felt like he couldn't talk to his wife. She didn't listen to him. I'm just simply saying, if you are not glued to society through friends, through girlfriends, to some extent through family, if you're not glued, then you're unglued. And those people are often come back to haunt that same society, right? Padlock, how old are you? You've asked some silly questions here. Are you a student? How old are you? I'd just be interested to know. Okay. So we dealt with BK Norton, and we actually really want to deal a little bit more detail with BK Norton. Who is she? What is that all about? Because she seems to know quite a lot about him. But we're going to leave the dynamics, and we're going to now move on to timeline. Right? We spent about an hour and a half dealing with the dynamics. Have you guys? Do you feel like you've got a deeper understanding of the dynamics as a result of this conversation? Eric says, I have some American freedom. Thank you. Thanks, Eric. I appreciate it. What does Chelsea say? It's quite an interesting question, and I'm going to come back to timeline in a moment. So this is going to be like the concluding remarks in terms of dynamics. Then we're going to timeline. For the rest of you who are watching, do you feel like you've learned a little bit more about the dynamics? As this have you do you feel like you have gotten fresh new insight as the subject matter of this episode is promised to deliver? Do you feel like you have gotten some fresh insight into the dynamics, things that you haven't thought about before? Now, in terms of Chelsea's question, I think it's a very interesting hypothetical to say, if he didn't go into criminology, do you think he would have still committed this crime? And again, it's assuming that he did commit the crime, right? I think there are two ways of answering it. I think the one way is, if you just take away, if he didn't study, right? If you take away the criminology and you just say, if he did something else besides studying, do you think he would have done X, Y, Z? And I think the answer is no. I think being exposed in a setting where there's this big party going on, there's this big community of people. So within the college setting, and the Pullman is a bigger campus than DeSale, it's a bigger campus than he was used to. In this setting where there are lots of kids and he's surrounded by people, but all alone, I think that was tremendously alienating and isolating and invalidating. So what I'm trying to say is, if you don't put him in a classroom, maybe he'll be okay. Again, if you don't put him in a setting with so many people sort of having fun, you could even argue if you put him in a different university setting, one that was a lot more conservative, then maybe he would have been okay. But the cultural setting and the social setting rubbed him the wrong way, or he rubbed them the wrong way, or both, right? So the one thing I would say is, if he didn't study, maybe he would have been okay. I don't think studying criminology helped him to not commit the crime within this argument that he's the suspect and he may have committed this crime. So that's often a better way of thinking about it than the sort of black and white way of thinking. So if you say, do you think him studying criminology helped? In other words, was something that would have led him not to think about committing crimes? Do you think him studying criminology would have helped to not think about how to cover up or get away with, or think about motives, or think about the agency that criminals get, the fame and the respect that they get from committing certain crimes? They get to be interviewed on television. They have books written about them. They have everybody talking about them. They do exert power and dominance and a certain kind of fearful respect while they're out there, and people don't know who they are, right? Does that make sense, what I'm saying? On the other hand, I wouldn't put it that way. I wouldn't say because he studied criminology, he became a criminal. I wouldn't put it that way at all. I wouldn't put it that way. Okay, John, I'm going to help you out. I'll help you out the door. Okay, so Cookie Cat says, I think he went into criminology because of urges. Not quite sure what you're saying there. I think he went into criminology because of urges. It could be that you could be right. It could be that he had certain feelings that he wanted to understand. Um, Again, I don't think it was the best way of dealing with it. Um, I don't think it was the best way of dealing with it. Okay, so now we're going to deal with the timeline. Someone is arguing that I'm on a loop here, but if I'm answering some of your questions, I am going to be pulling back slightly. I am trying to interact with you guys. So I've prepared a script, and what I can always do is I can go through the entire script, not answer any questions, and then come back and answer questions. I can do it that way if you guys want me to. So in terms of timeline, it looks like the semester only started on August 22nd, a Monday. And that was one day after Kohberger's first run-in with the law in Moscow, barely a mile from the funhouse. Did you guys know that? Did you guys realize that? The day that classes started was the day after his first run-in with the law, where they caught him close to midnight on a Sunday, driving without a seatbelt about a mile from the funhouse. And here is the confirmation of that. Classes started there. You see it right at the end. Let me bring it up a little bit bigger. Students can check in any day during the week of welcome, until Sunday, August 21st, the day before classes begin. And it does make you wonder, what the heck is he doing in Moscow when he's supposed to be settling in Pullman? What's he doing in Moscow? Suppose you could say that he went to eat at the Mad Greek. I suppose you could say that he heard about a party in Moscow. I suppose you could say that he was there to get drugs. I suppose you could say that as well. And so this is also from the New York Times. He moved across country. So he lived in the Pocono mountain areas his whole life. And then he moved cross country to Pullman, Washington, where he began the fall semester in August. Right? So that's when the classes started, late August. Now, if you think about it, how long is that to the crime being committed? The classes start in late August. And it gives you an idea just how quickly his fall from grace happened with his peers and the students he was teaching, and even his neighbors. You kind of get the feeling that he instantly repelled the people around him. Thanks so much, Ferrets Forever. I know you didn't want to be mentioned, but you have been. Thanks a lot. Can you see what I'm saying? Like, I imagined he arrived there in June and there was this sort of gradual process where he turned people off, but you actually feel like it was instant. Just like he went into the class on day one, they realized he's a jerk. Don't you get that idea? It wasn't like this slow process. It was a quick wake-up call that he's persona non grata, right? You see that? And I think that is an insight. It's this idea that he's so objectionable He's such a social misfit. He's so passionate. He's so a fish out of water that the impact that he has on them and the impact they have on him, that he emerges as a black sheep instantly. And that gives you an idea of just, again, how extreme it is, these emotions we're talking about. He's not just intense, he's very intense. He's not just passionate, he's very passionate. He doesn't just talk, he over talks in a way that's so horrible, you never want to talk to him again. He doesn't just overgrade so much, but so much that half the students protest, and it leads to this bad Teachergate incident. Thanks to Helen back, appreciate it. So do you see how, when you know when the semester started, and that's not rocket science, it's simply established information. The semester started 22nd August. The crime happened about 3 months later, right? 22nd August, 22nd September, 22nd October, and you would imagine by then the stalking's already in place. So if you let's say you say the premeditation, the idea to commit this crime took place in, let's say, October, then you only had August to September and September to October. You only had really 2 months for something to happen that someone felt, wow, I want to do this, right? That's super quick. And I suppose you could argue that he came from somewhere else. He came into Pullman angry and so on. I don't think that that's the case. I get the feeling that he came there with higher hopes. He came there feeling positive. He came there expecting a fairy tale. And the nightmare was so sudden and so unexpected and so unpleasant that it led to this reaction. Don't you get that idea? I think public embarrassment's a trigger for all of us. I don't think anyone, like a lot of people, if you think about what is the biggest nightmare, what's the most horrible thing you could imagine? Some people imagine have nightmares that they're giving a speech naked or something like that. Public humiliation is some of the worst things that we all try to avoid. It feels like death. It's like a social death, right? Thanks, Barbara. Appreciate it. So can you see that means that bad Teachergate must have happened almost immediately, right? In order for bad Teachergate to take place, in order for that to happen, you had to have them study, him grade them not like how he's been graded, and then that intervention that had to have happened virtually immediately. Not that he graded them in a nice way and they thought he was a good guy, and then later on they didn't. Instantly they didn't like the way he graded them. And then very quickly they said, we need to talk to you about this. We need to lodge our protest. And then there's the reaction to that where he then grades them properly. All of that plays out in a super, super quick time. Are you starting to feel the clockwork and the dynamics working together? Now you're getting a sense of what is really going on. And you don't get that by saying, oh, I think he was autistic. I agree with that as well. And so you've also got to ask the question, if Brian is the killer and he didn't kill anyone in Pennsylvania, what was going on in Washington that was so different? And that, in a way, is the $1 million question. Because he was a student in Pennsylvania. And I think one of the answers to that is, well, he was a teacher. He was teaching. He was in a kind of a vulnerable position in a social sense, because he was a teacher and he was humiliated in that sense. And he was also in a situation where he probably thought, I've arrived, I've made it, I'm a PhD student. only to be embarrassed in that setting as well, where his fellow PhD students think is a jerk and a black sheep. Can I share with you guys, because I was a teacher for little pieces of my life. I taught English in South Korea, and that was actually quite a pleasant experience because the kids are so respectful, because you also had a teaching assistant who kept things running, and they did a lot of the heavy lifting. You just came in there almost like, anyway. But when I taught in South Africa, I had an extremely humiliating experience that still troubles me to this day, right? So when I came back to South Africa, there was this difficulty in getting work, and I was overqualified and all of this kind of thing. And I ultimately ended up getting a job. This is when I came back from overseas. This is in a country that's got like over 30% unemployment, and they particularly discriminate against hiring you if you're a white man and if your surname sounds like it's Afrikaans or Dutch. In other words, me, right? And so I felt very lucky to get a job. And so the job that I got was at a school where my mother had been head girl. And I kind of sort of felt like this might actually work out quite well. That my mother's name is on a board in the hall of that school. And so in a way, because we were related to one another, it was sort of like a feather in my cap. My mother was head girl at the school. I'm now teaching at the school, and so on. And of course, things were totally different in my mother's day to when I taught. I won't go into exactly why or how, but very, very different. Also, things were totally different when I was at school and how I was taught to how, I guess, teaching, I guess, is supposed to be. And this is the way that I was really, really humiliated at this school. So I'm going to just take you through day one and basically the last day that I was there, right? Just those two. Obviously, there was a lot of other stuff as well. But on the very first day that I arrived, I wanted to teach English and literature and so on. And they said, no, there's only a job for you as teaching economics, because I'd studied economics at university. And so I think one of my very first classes, I came in with a very strict approach. I said, I'm not going to tolerate bad discipline. I'm going to run a tight ship. And I was barely seconds into my opening speech about how we're going to have a proper class set up, and it's going to be my way or the highway, basically, right? And a kid got up out of his chair from the back, walked right up to me, right? So in the middle of my speech about discipline, a kid gets up from the back, walks sort of one or two rows, and then walks directly towards me. And when he was about a couple of feet away from me, I just stopped talking because I was like, what is going on here? He continued to advance towards me, and then basically did a headbutt, right? And then he stopped himself like that far from my nose and my forehead. And I guess I came out of that quite well, because it was so out of left field that I didn't even react. I didn't like do that or anything like that. I just sort of stood there, because I mean, the last thing I expected was a kid to do that. And then I guess he was trying to intimidate me, which he succeeded in doing, but he didn't succeed in making it look like I was intimidated, because I just stood there. After he did it, I was like, okay, so I guess that's what you're trying to do. But it ended up backfiring, because he ended up looking not very smart. So maybe that wasn't very humiliating, but I felt very intimidated by that. I was like, jeepers, I actually get the message here. You guys are in charge, not me. There's a totally different discipline set up than when I was at school. And I then proceeded to give classes where everyone would just make a noise and shout and scream, and a small fraction of the class would pay attention. And it was like that in all the other classes as well. And I would complain about it, and they would just say, well, write down the thing on a disciplinary form, and then they would also steal the disciplinary form. So, and it was hell. It was hell. But it was personally embarrassing. Although the kids got a sense that I wasn't afraid, I came out of that experience feeling this isn't a very good. I don't know if I want this job. I didn't really sign up for this. The end of that whole process was, and you can see that I was trying to apply discipline as a way to have order in the class, like just as you'd say in true crime, being authentic. That's really can't imagine why you'd want to do that. Same thing at school. Why on earth would you want to discipline a disciplined classroom? Why would you want to do that? But I remember there's one day where they were particularly rowdy, and I simply said to them, and I think it's something that had happened when I was at school. The teachers did the same thing. Until the class is completely quiet, you can't go home. So the bell had gone, and the kids were just running around and screaming and whatever. And I just said, okay, as long as it takes until you guys can just settle down and be quiet, we're not leaving this class. And so they literally insisted on not settling down. And they ultimately, because I stood at the door, they ultimately jumped out the windows. And the result of that was that the principal somehow heard about this and then criticized me in front of all the staff. Like, what were you thinking to do that? Like, who does that? Tries to get his class to settle down before they leave. And he didn't mention my name, but he mentioned this idiot teacher that did this. And I felt incredibly humiliated by that, right? And so you could argue the same thing, that I didn't know how to handle this classroom situation, and I'd be the first person to say, yes, I didn't. I didn't know that it's this level of anarchy, and that the anarchy is okay. You're supposed to allow the anarchy to take place. There's a teacher in the classroom right next to mine that broke down often, and she was a qualified teacher and sweet young lady, and she would break down. She just, I can't do this. And what I'm trying to convey to you is that it can be soul destroying to be totally outnumbered by people that don't respect you or don't listen to you, and you're the odd one out, and you're trying to do your job. You're trying to do it the right way. And maybe it is the wrong way. Maybe how you do it is you be a lot less strict, right? So I've been wanting to share that insight, just how painful that experience can actually be. She was crying just because she was so frustrated. She just said, I remember her saying once that because of the system, the kids, even if they do no work, even if they fail, even if they don't, even if they don't pass their grades, this is what her complaint was, that they are allowed to graduate. And so what point did she have? What was the point in doing anything that she was doing? So that was her complaint. But I remember so often coming back from those classes and felt like the blood had literally been drawn out of my body. I felt like a fetus on my bed. I just needed to just crawl up into a fetus, into a ball, and slowly a little bit of energy would sort of come back into you. It really felt like your life was being literally sucked out of you every single day. And I would not be exaggerating if I said those are probably the 6 hardest months of my life. And what made it even harder was the kids lied about their names. So you're trying to get to know them. So for 6 months, they would tell you their name, but it wasn't actually their name, and that was a big joke. So it was a Holocaust. It was really, really horrible. But I'm just trying to share with you how the teaching experience can feel incredibly painful. Not just being someone in the class as a classmate, as a pupil, but the teaching experience can be particularly unpleasant. So with that in mind, I want to take you back into the timeline, and I want to address another aspect, which is something that I don't think has been brought up. If it has, let me know. So can you see in this post behind me, it refers to, it's not over here. Let me try and bring it up again. Can you see in this extract from the New York Times, it refers to B.K. Norton. And B.K. Norton is a she, and she talks about Brian and how he undergoes certain changes. Well, I found some more information about B.K. Norton that you may or may not be aware of. And it comes from a website called, I think it's PJ Media. I don't know if it's a blog. I don't really know how credible it is, but what they say in this blog, and it seems to be in a way critical of his classmates, is they say, was Kohberger cancelled by his classmates for wrongthink? Right? And so this particular student, and I'm just repeating what is being said here. I don't really have a horse in the race, but they say that here that Norton is a lesbian. I don't know if that's true or not, but you could imagine if she was, she wouldn't have appreciated those anti-LGBTQ remarks, and she may have been a leader or the main protagonist saying, Brian is persona non grata. You know, he's declared himself my enemy, so I'm his enemy, right? And so the question he has raised, it's one thing to say he was the black sheep. We didn't like him. He made unpleasant comments. This is taking it to a whole new level, saying, was he cancelled by his classmates? Now, you know what cancelled means? It basically means you are reduced to nothing. You are your agency is totally taken away from you. It's made clear in no uncertain terms that you are not part of the group, that you are a null and a zero, right? Canceling someone is destroying them. Canceling someone is rendering them powerless and impotent, right? It's a deliberate. It's literally removing that person's social status entirely. In other words, it is bringing about their social death, that they literally have no social influence anymore, right? You kind of had, if you're not sure what I'm talking about, Will Smith was basically in that place where he was to some extent cancelled and experiencing social death after that slap, right? That's what it feels like in a grand theater where everyone's watching. Everyone realizes that your credibility, your respectability, your power, your influence, all of that is being brought down, right? And so you experience that as, I have been cancelled. And isn't that exactly how he felt? Right? It's not a little silly little thing and maybe overreacted. You would too. If you were cancelled at varsity, you would feel pretty unhappy about it as well. Are you starting to get a sense of where there can be real fuel, real fire for tremendous opprobrium, tremendous frustration, tremendous anger, not a little bit of anger, tremendous anger. Can you get a sense of where that might be coming from? And I'm not trying to justify what's going on here. I'm trying to see how the process fits together. I'm not trying to say that someone's right or justified or rationalized. I'm simply trying to say that's the machine of the criminal psychology. That is how it was put together. Being labeled can also do that. It instantly reduces you to whatever someone says you are. That's true. If teachers don't behave the right way, then they get what's coming to them, right? But I mean, we said this right in the beginning, emasculation, right, and frustration. That's exactly what we're seeing. Ferret says, when are we going to stop other humans from feeling like crap? I don't think it's as simple as that. Sometimes other humans also treat you badly, and you've got to respond. In the Will Smith saga, was he justified with that slap kind of thing? Weren't we all surprised that, like, was that like, cheapers? That's not what I would expect from you, kind of thing. So the change in Kohberger, like the timeline, is not quite as linear as we might imagine. We're not sure exactly when, but Kohberger went through a period where he was haggard, perhaps because he was moonlighting as a werewolf until late at night in Moscow, doing who knows what besides that at all hours, and then driving back and simply trying to survive his classes during the day. So here's another quote from this article, where she says, it wasn't meant to be offensive. Fox News spoke with classmate Sarah Healy, who went to high school with Kohberger, and described him as a socially awkward kid who didn't understand social cues, and he often offended people without knowing it. She also said he was treated poorly by female students. And the idea you get here, where she says it wasn't meant to be offensive, you kind of get the idea that she's saying she's defending him, and she's a female, but defending the high school Brian and saying he wasn't trying to be offensive, he wasn't trying to be rude, he wasn't meaning to be objectionable, right? Yeah, he could feel that way. Thanks, Susan. He's not trying to be obnoxious. In fact, he's trying to do the opposite. He's trying to impress them. He's trying to ingratiate himself with them. He's trying to prove himself in a way, right? And so she says it was like childlike curiosity from an adult who you would think would know better than to ask a question, but it was such a genuine curiosity. And that's why I thought he was so sheltered. That's not my word, that's her word. So even in the high school setting, she encountered him as sheltered. And another word for sheltered is closeted or coddled, right? Or even insulated. So in other words, you kind of get the idea that for some other reason, he seemed to be a kid who was at home a lot, with his folks a lot, who didn't socialize a lot, who was somehow he was in an insular setting, and somehow ended up being, there it is, sheltered. How can you be sheltered if you're still at high school? The answer is, aren't you coddled at home? Aren't you overprotected at home? Aren't you the star at the dinner table at home? But it's totally different when you're not there. And didn't his own family know that and appreciate that? Hence, his own father said to the neighbor, can you please be friends with my 28-year-old son, because he struggles with that, because he always has. These comments about he's not trying to be offensive were echoed by a classmate at Washington State Criminology graduate program. And there's Ben Roberts. There's his name. Let me bring this up. Let's take myself away. I had honestly just pegged him as being super awkward. That's what Ben Roberts said. My impression of him was he didn't mean any harm. He was just super awkward. And there he goes on to say he was always looking for a way to fit in. Super awkward and looking for a way to fit in. So can you see, we're not just dealing with a kid who goes to college and things don't really work out well. You're dealing with a kid who struggled his whole life to fit in, who's from a closeted, sheltered, insular background. And then he goes to Pullman. And not only does he not fit in, it's not only a case that he goes there and he's sort of invisible, or he goes there and he doesn't make an impression. He makes an impression, but it's the wrong one. He makes an impression, he talks a lot, he's intense, he's passionate, and it falls not on deaf ears. They hear that it's anti-LGBTQ, and they decide that not only are you not going to fit in, you're going to be pushed out. So the thing that he wants, which is to make friends and to be part of something, he achieves instead the opposite result. He's ostracized. That is 10 times worse being ostracized when you're trying to belong, when you're coming from this place of loneliness anyway. And despite all your efforts, in spite of all your efforts, you're actually pushed out even further. So now it's even worse. And then doesn't that repeat when he goes to Moscow as well? He tries to meet them as well, only for the exact same thing to happen as well. Hello, how are you? Just totally ignored. You look like a dweeb. You are a decade older than I am, not going to respond to you. And so he's constantly being pushed away. He's constantly reaching out and he's constantly having those efforts pushed away. And although it's tempting to feel sorry for him, I think the better response from us is to try and figure out what would have been a better course of action than if he allegedly committed this crime. Instead of feeling sorry for him, and I'm sure he felt sorry for himself, instead of feeling sorry for him, and I'm sure his parents felt sorry for him, instead of feeling sorry for him, what would have been a more constructive use of that anger? How about getting a dog? How about taking up sport? How about being more of a listener? Just that, just being more of a listener. How about picking up on the cues that people don't appreciate what you're saying? How about asking someone, I don't know why I'm struggling to fit in. Do you have any advice for me? All right. Do you think he lacked a sense of humor? I think if he was intense, then he may have, yes. That could also be part of it. And so can you see how the timeline is really important? So when you say the classes started and this process got underway, and again, if you say the timeline is important in terms of his studies, how on earth do you then make the case that is there a link to the criminology? I don't know. That's also crazy. Like, if you want to really make that link explicit, then you look at the timeline. You look at when Bad Teachergate happened. You look at when he came to Pullman and why didn't a crime happen before that? And then you also look at what time of the year and at what is the context taking place in the timeline when the crime happened. Well, a big football game. Do you think he was part of that? Do you think if he had no friends and he'd been kicked to the curb and his peers didn't like him and disrespected him, do you think there's any chance he's going to go to that football game? Do you think the kids at Pullman would have gone to University of Idaho to watch the game and also partied there? Do you think that would have been the case? I do. And so he's not going to be part of that. And so these parties are gathering steam, right? the semester's gathering momentum, and what's happening at the same time? He's having a fall from grace. He's not even really marking their work anymore. He's instead just, I give up, right? So the timeline is the one thing, the dynamics are another, and putting those two together, you get the real context that this is taking us into. But let me ask you a question. If we feel like we've learned something in this episode, do you know the answer to this question? Sorry, Kohberger with an H. By the way, Kohberger apparently is a name that derives from the German word, I think, for coal, and Berger means someone who piles it up. So I think the etymology of his name comes from this idea of a blue-collar laborer who's a coal miner or someone who gathers coal, right? That's the etymology of his surname, as I understand it. I could be wrong. Don, thanks a lot. I appreciate that. So, do you know when Kohberger arrived in Pullman for the first time? Elliot says, I'm a blind man. I hope you can, I'm sure you can hear me saying this. Welcome, Elliot. I can't read the live chat, but does anyone know why he even moved from Pennsylvania to the Northeast when there are much better equal schools closer to home? I think one way you can address that question is, why do a lot of students go to the colleges that they go to? Sometimes they want to get away from home. Sometimes they want a new experience. Sometimes it's got to do with costs. Sometimes it's got to do with which has got the best doctorate program, which has got the best, maybe it was a scholarship that took him to a particular school, that only certain schools, you know. When do you think Kohberger arrived in Pullman for the first time? Pharaoh says June 2022. June. Good answers. So let me take that a step further. Do you know on what date he arrived? Do you know exactly when he arrived in Pullman? Ferrets forever. I just feel like when you feel sorry for someone in a situation, it's almost like you give in to the problem rather, and you say, oh, it's so sad. Let's all kumbaya and hug one another. On this channel, we actually want to learn the lessons from, like, in a cautionary tale aspect. And when you're feeling sorry for someone, you're not learning a lesson. I think you learn the lesson when you stay objective and you say, let's try not to get too emotional, sentimental about a potential murderer. Let's try and see what he could have done, and what someone else could have done in the same situation differently, better, more constructively, because he's not the first person to be in that situation. He's not the first person to maladapt to that situation. How could he have done better? And what's quite interesting is you've got one of the victims has a dog in the story, right? If the perpetrator in the story also had a dog, would he have committed this crime? Would he have been so lonely and so upset and so angry if he had a dog? Okay, so in terms of the question, when exactly did he arrive in Pullman? It's actually quite a difficult question, but someone did touch on it earlier. This is from the affidavit. It says, on December 23, I was granted a search warrant for Kohberger's, I think that's, what is CSLI? I did search for that before. Is it cellular location information? phone records. It stands for cell site location information, right? So it's basically the GPS data on his phone. That's really what they were asking for, right? Is Terry still here? Just me says, I'm half asleep. I feel like I'm in class. I'm afraid I'm a very boring teacher. But if you if you can use me as ASMI, maybe that'll help you actually get to sleep. Terry is here. That's good. Okay. So the cell site location information that he gathers, he gets it from June 23, 2022. So that seems to be very close to the date that Kohberger must have arrived in town. Don't you agree? That he must have arrived around about June 23rd, 2022. Right? And then you sort of wonder, what did he do that day? Where did he go that day? And it's a whole process of he's got to furnish his apartment and he's got to figure his way around. But it's kind of at the end of June, but bear in mind his classes only start in August. So you can also imagine, could there not have been, so first of all, did he get to know the funhouse even before? Was he aware of the funhouse? Was he aware of the Mad Greek restaurant? Was he aware of any of the victims even before the whole emasculation episode at his campus? Right? In other words, what was he doing between June 23 and August 22? What was he doing in Washington for basically 2 whole months? What is he doing? Now, I think what it means is he had a lot of free time to be lonely. He had a lot of free time to be thinking about what is in front of him. So it's summer, and what is he doing for those 2 months? He's waiting for things to start, but he's also preparing. Right? Think about that. 2 months is already in the area, and he's basically preparing for the next phase of his life. Right? So can you see how much expectation that there likely was? He's putting his life together in Pullman, and he set aside 2 whole months to move in, to settle in, to figure out his way around. This is going to be his home for the next couple of years. And he's eagerly awaiting his classes to begin because he's going to make new friends and he's going to impress them, and he's going to come out of it with his doctorate and he's going to have this great adventure. Well, is that what happened? So that's giving us an idea, just again, of the timeline and really where it's starting. But it starts with 2 months even before the classes start. I must say, I originally assumed that he arrived in June and classes started a week later or something like that. 2 months is quite a long time just to be loitering around. There's another reference in the affidavit, just says here, on December 23rd, I received historical records for the phone from the time the account was opened in June 2022. So the account was opened in June 2022. And I assume what that means is he gets a contract that is based in Washington for his phone. It does make you wonder, does he have one phone and another contract? What happened to his previous contract? But anyway, he opened an account June 2022. Now, I don't know this. If you're in America and you change states, do you need to get a cellular contract for that state. I would not imagine so. I know in the Chris Watts case, you had North Carolina numbers and Colorado numbers calling. Is there an expense associated with that? New phone, new number. Is there an expense associated if you go to a different state and your cell phone contract is based in another state? Is it more expensive? You can keep your number. So I think one does have to wonder, is there a burner phone situation here? What happened to his previous number? All of that kind of thing. And if he does change his phone contract, it does make you wonder, was something afoot? Did he come into the situation with something in mind? My answer is no, but it certainly does make you wonder. Most providers are nationwide. Do you have some providers that are not nationwide? So if he'd lived in Pennsylvania his whole life, could he have been using a provider in Pennsylvania that didn't serve Idaho or Washington or both? Could you have something like that? So do you have any providers that you get a discount if they only serve one state? I'd be interested to know, because otherwise it's quite interesting. Why did he open an account in June? Why did he not just continue with the account that he did have? Andrea says some will pay state taxes. So if you are scrimping for money and you're trying to save, you sort of penny pinching, could that have been a factor? Maybe he was on his parents' plan. It's also quite interesting. Another possibility is that when he worked as a security guard, he was on the plan of his employer. And now that he was somewhere else, as far as I know, he was no longer a security guard in 2021. So I don't know if that applies. Anyway. Anyway, that's just kind of an interesting, yeah, that's also a really good point. Maybe you could get a student discount under a different contract, right? Doesn't that make sense? Banks tend to offer different rates as well, and cellular providers as well. It's a good point. Different service, you might get better. Some carriers may have better service in certain areas. It's a good point. Kimberly says not all do work nationally. Okay. Bash Bro says I can't believe so many people don't see the holes in the state's case. There are big holes like D's. I mean, where D says I saw someone walking, is it really likely that someone with the dog barking, someone would have just walked outside the house, walked past her and out the house, walked and not ran? Joe Kelly says he probably had better coverage there than what he had in Pennsylvania. So I do think it's a good point that it maybe he was getting a student contract or something like that. Okay. And then there's one more that I want to share with you. It's also from the affidavit. I received records for 8458 from AT&T. These records indicated that the phone is subscribed to Brian Kohberger at an address in Albrightsville, Pennsylvania. So what that's telling you is that the phone is subscribed to Pennsylvania, but the contract, it's a different contract. Does that take us in any particular direction? The account has been open since June 23, 2022. Definitely adds another area that we need to get confirmation on. Do you agree? He does have campus internet. Michael says, doesn't Verizon offer nationwide coverage? He's with AT&T. Thanks, Terry. I also want to show you this and get your opinion on it. It's a post that is being attributed to his mother. There's so much fake news around this case. It's hard to take anything that's not clear seriously. But somebody writes, "Hi friends, today my 26-year-old," and I mean he was turning 29 in last year. So could a mother be out by 2 years of her own son's age? Anyway, my 26-year-old son left for Washington State to begin his doctorate in criminology. We live in Pennsylvania. I'll be crying because I'll miss him so much. And that was sent June 25th, 2022. So this is posted around about 2 days after he arrived in Idaho. And it's possible that this is fake because she says today he left for Washington, whereas the contract was taken out 2 days earlier. So is this a credible thing? It's hard to say, but this also seems to just corroborate that the time that he was in sort of at his apartment was late June. But you guys think that this is true? I'm in South Africa, so that's the time that this is reflecting, right? It's the timestamp for where I am. The time is wrong, but the date is that date. The question is this post legitimate? Is that the day that Kohberger left for Washington? Okay. Let's have a look again at the poll. 88% say, do you think the case will go to trial? Yes. Okay. No, he didn't post it from South Africa. Yeah, well, either she got his age wrong or it's not her. That's also possible. Maybe she didn't want it to seem not as flattering. Yeah, that's also possible. Susan says he got a Pennsylvania phone number. Okay. Okay, that makes sense. Okay, so that brings us back to, and I'm going to kind of sign off now. Having covered all of that, do you think there's a link between him studying criminology? Let me ask it in this way. Jean has said, I don't think there's a link at all. Have I changed your thinking, or have I influenced your thinking at all in that department? That there may be a link, there could be a link, that there's reason to believe that there may well be a link. What do you guys think? What do you guys say? Eric, I agree with half of what you say. I think there is a link. I do think bullying has something to do with it. Michelle says, I think there is a link. Sleuth and Sandal says, I see it. There is a link, very possible. Link, no question. Link. Just curious says there may well be a link. Alan says, looks like there is a connection. Veredictum says there's a minor link. But anyway, the majority of you seem to think there is a link. Thanks a lot, Don. Thank you. Very generous. Lepeti says a link. The songbird says definitely a link, right? And the reason why I'm emphasizing this is because I find it sort of amusing and kind of silly and kind of baffling that you've got his own criminology professor. I mean, she put this tweet up. Doesn't that mean she supports what's in the article, right? Now, she would say, don't put words in my mouth. I didn't say there's not a link, but she's questioning whether there's a link, and she's highlighting this article. And the article is all about, and I'm going to be dealing with it separately. This article is all about making the case. Criminology folk and professors and all whatnot, all basically saying, don't be absurd. There's no link between the criminology and what Kohberger did. All I'm trying to say is you've literally got a criminology professor kind of going, is there a link? Which I find, as I say, quite baffling. And in this analysis, I've tried to explicitly show that link. And in the analysis that's going to follow, in the coverage I'm going to do following this, we're going to deal with this article that sort of rhetorically asks, but as a way of saying, is there a link? Of course not. Is there a link to him studying criminology? Don't be absurd. Well, think about how that reflects on them, that you're a criminology professor and one of your own charges now seems to have committed something. Now, either you own that and you acknowledge that and you talk about that, or you deny it. What do you think they're doing? If Brian felt humiliated at college, if Brian felt embarrassed, do you think someone coming out of a PhD thing is humiliating and embarrassing for that faculty? Well, you know that they stripped his photo from the sort of, there's like a clipboard where all the kids' photos and names are shown. Well, they've taken Brian's picture off that. Well, isn't that because they aren't very proud of their star student? Right? So I think it's a bit disingenuous to say there's no link, because it's a little way of hand-wringing and washing your hands and saying, no, it's got nothing to do with criminology. It's got nothing to do with me. It's got nothing to do with the people he was around. It's got nothing to do with anything. It's simply some odd dude, odd duck who it's totally not connected to that, totally disconnected to that. I think it was because of being disconnected. And I think it was because he was disconnected to the thing he wanted to be connected to. I just find it really interesting that the professor of criminology, who is supposed to be telling you what links there are with criminals, is saying, well, is there a link to that question mark? Don't you find that a little odd? Normally, these criminology professors are telling you how things work. And this argument is to say, no, there isn't a link. Okay, so then what is the process? I think it does look bad for them. That's why you've had this deafening silence from the whole criminology professor group. You haven't heard anything from them. Okay, Eric, that's not what we're saying. We're not saying someone taught him criminology and is now responsible for what he did. We're not saying that at all. We're saying, did it play a factor, his knowledge of criminology? We're not saying one of his professors taught him how to be a criminal and so it's her fault. We're not saying that at all. I also think it's interesting how she doesn't comment at all, even in this tweet. She just repeats the tweet, putting up a question then. And you could even argue that couldn't they call Catherine Ramsland, potentially, the defense call her as a witness to basically say there's no link between the criminology and Brian Kohberger. She could potentially be called as a defense witness. Interesting, isn't it? I also find it strange. So that's the one thing we're going to deal with following this, right? And in other words, that article, what's in it, why she supports it, what that means. And then the other thing that I'm going to deal with is, how did Kohberger actually mark? What was in more specific detail, what was so annoying about what he was doing? And if it was you and it was your paper, would you be aggravated or would you like that level of attention, right? So why were the students so unhappy with the way he was marking them? We're going to look at that in a practical sense, right? And then another area. So everything that I've dealt with now is in a way a broad introduction to digging deeper into other areas. So another area I want to deal with separately. I thought I would have time to do it in this live, but I'm going to wrap up now. Another aspect is, how is the culture of Moscow in particular? I mean, the crime took place in Moscow. What was the culture in Moscow in particular? And how is it different to the culture that he knew, that he was so ensconced in and sheltered inside in a cocoon in Pennsylvania, right? We know that there was some kind of shift, but specifically, how did that feel, and what are we talking about? And so I have found something that really sheds light on that in a very interesting way. And so that's something to look forward to. So it's basically, we're going to go into more detail into the culture and then the link, if there's a link and not, and why these people are disputing it. Okay, so that's it. I'm going to end off with this little anecdote. And this is something I've seen, this pattern repeating over and over again, time and time again in true crime. It's weird. If I put my hand here, my face turns blue. If I take it away, it goes sort of orange. Blue, orange. So it looks like I'm a chameleon. Blue, orange. Anyway, that's what I see. I don't know if you guys see that. I want to share this with you, something that I've noticed happening over and over again in true crime, a pattern that repeats itself. And the pattern is, someone comes from a place of struggle from a long way in their backstory, that they've been building their way up to a fairy tale or to a particular outcome. And in other words, there's a lot of expectation associated with that long period of struggle. There's a lot of anticipation, but there's also the investment into a fairy tale. And that makes, when things go pear-shaped, a million times worse. If you were in a situation and things just didn't work out, that's one thing. But when you contrast that with the struggle and you integrate it with the struggle, it makes it 10 times worse. And to illustrate that with a silly example, some of you know that there's a yellow weaver bird, bright yellow. It weaves these nests, and it previously built 7 nests in my garden, only to tear them down. On my birthday, it built the 8th or 9th nest. It's just torn that nest down, right? And what is so embedded in that whole situation is that it's one thing to tear down one nest, to build a nest and tear down one nest. It's another thing if you built 8 or 9 or 10 nests and had to tear all of them down, right? Do you see where I'm coming from? If your struggle is that you built one nest and your nest was torn down because you made offensive remarks, that's one thing. It's a totally different kettle of fish if you built 10 nests. And didn't it feel to Brian as if he'd built 10 nests? He'd worked in this way, he'd worked in that way. He'd worked as a security guard. He'd overcome a heroin addiction. He'd overcome being the fat boy at school. He'd come out of the sticks of rural Pennsylvania and was hoping to make it onto the big time. It'd come all the way to become a PhD, and only to have that nest dismantled by we don't like you, you made an anti-LGBTQ remark, so break down your nest. Thanks so much, Alina. I appreciate it. Nice picture of you, by the way. Like the flowers behind you. Lex Luthor says 100% will go to trial. Well, I've only brought it up because an expert has just said that she's not sure if it will. And I think it's worth thinking about, because I think we're at a place now where it's almost like, guys, let's let this go now. Let's pick it up in 5 months at the trial. Well, there may not be a trial. And that's what she says. I think this is the right point. See?
The triangulation is happening. The dotted lines, especially with your terrific guest from People Magazine reporter, who's talking about those contacts, those DMs through Instagram. I mean, all of this just keeps tracing, and those dotted lines get more and more solid with each piece of evidence. I'm curious also about those receipts from Walmart and from Marshall's.
Yes.
So I'm trying to find where she says it's going to go to trial. I think it's over here.
And of course, that is what his defense attorney would do if it goes to trial, which I truly don't think it will. It depends.
Right? So she's saying, I truly don't think it's going to go to trial. Let me ask you a question. If he's smart, do you think the smart strategy here, if you were Brian, if you were his parents, and if you were his lawyer, would you recommend he goes to trial? In other words, do you think you could mount a successful defense? I think there's a very strong possibility of exactly that because it's such a high profile case, like with the Chris Watts case, because it's particularly shocking and horrific and gratuitous and cruel, you could make the argument that you really are going to be facing the death penalty, right? And if you don't want to face the death penalty, we've got all of this evidence on you, well, then take a plea deal. Spare your family the humiliation. Don't put them through that. Accept a plea bargain for his life. And by the way, they're already talking about a plea deal in the Alec Baldwin case, where they actually, I've heard comments saying the state is going to want to accept a plea bargain with him, meaning they're not going to be able to afford to prosecute him, right? And I must say, I think there's a 90% possibility of a plea deal in the Alec Baldwin case, simply because he can't afford for the bad publicity of his thing to get any worse than it's already gotten. He wants to get back to his movie career. So from a PR perspective, he can say all the right things. I'm innocent and we will fight the charges. But I won't be surprised if behind closed doors there's a quiet settlement. The other thing with Kohberger is he's got 5 months to not decide to take a plea deal. 5 months is quite a long time. It's quite a long time for someone who's reactionary, for someone who does the Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde thing, to stay consistent. The one area where I think it would make sense to go to trial is, does he not want to show how smart he is? And so not going to trial would be an acknowledgement that he's not so smart. And I think he does still want to prove how clever he is. It depends on how much he wants to prove how clever he is and how much he actually is clever. If he actually is clever, then he may realize what his chances are at a trial, especially when, for example, if that blood evidence comes back and the victim's DNA is on that in his apartment, how on earth do you intelligence your way out of that one? Okay, I'll deal with, for the next 4 minutes before I sign off, I'll deal with a couple of questions. How can we compare an accidental shooting? We're talking about the plea deal aspect of it. We're talking about the legal, the fact of legal agency. It's also not entirely accidental if there are a lot of accidents waiting to happen. Sorry, if so many accidents take place, then it eventually becomes an accident waiting to happen. But that was before he knew about the contents of the affidavit. And for example, if the animal head does come back from his apartment as belonging to a golden doodle, it does come back as a positive match to Murphy, then it's very hard to imagine that it's not going to be a slam dunk. You can have a trial, but it's really just going to be a show trial. If there's a certain amount of evidence, it's really going to just amount to ticking off boxes and making an appearance. Do you really want to do that? I think it's likely. I think that's likely. He could also, and that's a really good point from Christopher, is he says that he could, in part of the plea deal is that you get special treatment in prison. And that's what Chris Watts got. And so, do you want to spend a life behind bars with the general population, or life behind bars somewhere else? And that is definitely a big carrot to be offering. Someone says, where can I find where it says Brian's DNA was the DNA on the sheath? No, they just said that they found DNA on the sheath and it was a match to his father's DNA. Do you feel sorry for his parents and sisters? I do. I do. There is reasonable doubt with regards to D, right? And contamination of the crime scene. And is there an accomplice? There's that area can bring in reasonable doubt, but you can play that game about reasonable doubt, and you can also try and get the jury to sympathize with him. And you could play the whole thing as there's no clear motive. I think you can come up with a very compelling motive, but you can also argue that there isn't a clear, obvious motive here. There isn't a clear, obvious connection to the victims. The problem is if there's enough circumstantial evidence and forensic evidence, then all of that theater becomes basically pageantry. It becomes silly. Oh, Jason, good to have you here. It's Jason's first live. Good to see you. Bad news though is I've hit 3 hours 30, so I'm about to sign off. So a lot can happen between summer where I am, winter in Idaho now, and when the trial is the preliminary hearing supposed to take place in the summer of this year. Seasons are going to shift from winter to spring and to summer. Is there going to be a change of heart from Brian? Is there going to be a shift from his side? Is he going to slowly come out of denial? Is he going to, how smart is he really going to be? Is he going to be able to successfully defend himself? That's another question. Could he actually beat the prosecution? Are there things that we don't know about? Someone sent, and this is the last thing I want to show you. Someone sent me this comment, which is really raises your eyebrows. Is it this one? No, it's not. By the way, this is an image I found of Kohberger. So while I'm looking for something else, I'll just put it on screen. There it is. That's him in the middle over there. But what I really want to share with you as the parting shot is this. Where is it? I think it's the next one. No, I can't find it. Could be this one. What do you guys think of this? And I think this was posted on Reddit. Moscow Police Captain Darlinger's comment on 2020. So posted on Reddit, but it comes from the documentary. He says at that timestamp, there's going to be lots of parts of this case that are going to be surprising to most. Interviewer, so there's bombshells that haven't dropped. We are not done yet. What do you think he's talking about with these bombshells that haven't dropped yet? I suppose that could be anything. I suppose it could be, does he have an accomplice? Personally, I don't think he does. Was he absolutely fascinated with Jeffrey Dahmer? Personally, I think he was. Did he go into the funhouse and he was kicked out? Right? Did he go there? Was he invited to a party, or he went there and he was actually kicked out? What are these bombshells that haven't dropped? So we'll see. But he's saying parts of this case are going to be surprising to most people. So I guess we'll see what that ends up meaning. Maybe he even means it's surprising in the sense that he didn't really have even connections with the victims, maybe in that sense. or the DNA link. There may even be multiple DNA links, definitely. What is going on his Fire Stick? What is going on in the browser history? And maybe he knows that that animal hairs is the smoking gun. Maybe he knows that. That would be surprising to a lot of people. Okay, so I'm not going to take it further than that. We've missed Bria and we've missed is SM Kowalinsky here, but it's good to have Terry on the job. Thanks a lot for your moderating. It's been a mostly good session, I think. Thanks a lot for your questions and comments. I don't think that that's likely. Otherwise, it would have been a lot easier to figure out much earlier on. Wouldn't have taken 47 days. Terry, you're just in time to say goodbye. Sorry about your technical difficulties. I've also had some, I've got to say as well. None of the survivors were involved. Terry says, why are we not hearing about cameras around his apartment? Well, bear in mind, law enforcement can't really talk about that. That's part of their case. So that's something we'll probably hear at trial, if there is a trial. The 911 recording, the recordings of the cameras we'll likely see. So should be quite interesting. Okay, so it's 11 o'clock in the morning here. I'm going to take my dog for a walk. The sun's starting to come out. It's risen, but it was rainier earlier, and the sun's starting to come out. So I'm going to skedaddle. Good night. Good night. Thanks a lot, Aquavenus. Appreciate it. The songbird says it's 1 a.m. here. You must have a good sleep. Thanks, guys. Ferret Forever says, I feel more for Murphy than anyone. Really? I also feel for Jack, I must say, who's looking after Murphy. And Hunter, you know, the siblings. And the friends, Phoebe, Martha, you know, you've got to feel for them as well. Miami says it's 4 a.m. here. Time for bed, right? The difference, Emma, with OJ is OJ was able to hire a dream team. Kohberger can't hire an elite lawyer, doesn't have the money. Okay, guys. Yvonne, sleep well. Everybody else, hope you have a brilliant night's sleep. Hope you wake up rested tomorrow. I'll probably follow this up, not now, but this time tomorrow with an analysis on Alec Baldwin. If you haven't heard anything on that, you're not going to want to miss this. It's the reason I did 88 episodes on that case. It's a lot more complex and convoluted, that case, than what you may have thought until now. So I'm really looking forward to that. We'll be covering Alec Baldwin and what he said in that. We're going to review what he said in that infamous ABC interview and then look at his legal position. Thanks, everyone, for being here. Take care. Have a lovely sleep. I'll see you guys next time. Thanks a lot for the super chats. Welcome to all the new members. Bear in mind, this community also has a sort of a sideshow on Patreon. So if you're interested in joining that community, I am very interactive with the folks there. Then head to patreon.com/TCRS. You can get access to a lot of content for $2 a month and audiobooks that I've narrated on a host of cases. Amanda Knox, John Benet Ramsey, Madeleine McCann, Chris Watts, Scott Peterson. Those audiobooks are on the $5 tier. So look out for that. Also, Casey Anthony. Thanks, guys. Thanks for being here. I'll see you guys next time.